In the grand halls of palaces and the dusty corners of lost archives, there are secrets the crown never wanted you to hear. Not scandals, legacies, not gossip, whispers woven into the bloodline, from vanishing princes to phantom heirs, forbidden marriages to medical cover-ups. These aren't just royal missteps, they're history's most unsettling loose threads. This isn't about fairy tales, it's about the rot beneath the throne. Welcome to 33 Darkest English Royal Family Secrets, where the crown gleams but the shadows never leave. Before we dive into the first secret, make sure you're subscribed. This rabbit hole only gets deeper from here. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Toronto? We want to know who's wandering the halls of history with us tonight. 1. The Princes in the Tower. It's one of those mysteries that doesn't age. It just deepens like a bruise. 2 young boys, a locked tower, no bodies, no witnesses, no justice, just a cold silence that's lingered for over 5 centuries. The year was 1483. England was still staggering from the War of the Roses, a decades-long civil bloodbath dressed in velvet and crowned in thorns. When King Edward IV died suddenly, his 12-year-old son, Edward V, was next in line. But the crown sat uneasy on the boy's head. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, moved swiftly to protect him, and within weeks, Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, were locked away in the Tower of London for their safety. It was the last time anyone ever saw them alive. Now, let's pause here for a moment. The Tower of London wasn't always a dungeon. It was, ironically, a royal residence, just one with a talent for swallowing people whole, especially children, especially when a throne was involved. Richard, the uncle, soon declared the boys illegitimate. Suddenly, they weren't princes at all. Parliament ratified it, he took the crown, and became Richard III. No coronation for Edward V, no rebellion from the nobility, just a curious silence, as if the entire court had agreed to misplace 2 children and never mention it again. For centuries, history played it like a grim fairy tale. The wicked uncle murders the rightful heirs to steal the throne. Easy, clean, emotionally satisfying in a perverse way. But real history is rarely that tidy, and the deeper you dig, the less dirt you find, because the trail disappears entirely. There were no confessions, no trials, no confirmed sightings, no bodies until allegedly 1674, when 2 skeletons were discovered under a staircase in the tower during renovations. Charles II had them reburied in Westminster Abbey under the names of the princes, but conveniently, no forensic testing was done until the 20th century. Even then, no DNA confirmation, just an assumption wrapped in royal ribbon. So who could have done it? The list isn't short. Richard III had motive, certainly, but so did the Duke of Buckingham, a power-hungry opportunist who turned on Richard not long after. Some even argue Henry Tudor, later Henry VII, had just as much to gain. After all, dead princes make for fewer rivals. Here's where it gets darker. What if they weren't murdered at all? A handful of scattered records from foreign courts suggest that at least one of the boys may have escaped. In fact, several pretenders emerged in later years, claiming to be Richard, the younger prince. The most famous, Perkin Warbeck, executed in 1499 for treason after years of claiming royal identity. Was he a fraud? Probably. Was he the prince? No one could prove he wasn't. And yet the Tudors, Henry VII especially, seemed nervous enough to silence any rumour. Henry married Elizabeth of York, the prince's sister, to consolidate his power. A politically brilliant marriage, but also a whispering acknowledgement that legitimacy could only be repaired through union, not proof. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this whole saga isn't the disappearance, it's the collective shrug. The way the royal machine absorbed the crime and kept marching undisturbed, the way the nobles nodded along, the way history adjusted itself around a royal absence like a ghostly outline. Richard III's body was eventually discovered in a Leicester car park in 2012. DNA confirmed his identity. Scoliosis had twisted his spine, but the wounds on his skeleton were far worse. He died brutally at Bosworth Field, the last English king to die in battle. His death ended the Plantagenet dynasty and ushered in the Tudors. The history books closed his chapter with poetic satisfaction. The murderer undone by fate. But what if he wasn't the murderer? What if history crowned a killer because it needed a villain? What if the real story was never about two boys in a tower, but about how a monarchy digests its own crimes and carries on with a straight face? The truth might be buried under that staircase, or in a burned letter, or maybe it never existed at all. That's the thing about royal secrets. They aren't just buried, they're cultivated. And speaking of cultivation, no monarch was more obsessed with the engineering of bloodlines than the man who came next. The one whose wives kept dying, or worse, miscarrying, without explanation. A king who changed England forever, not just through war or religion, but by what he may have passed through his veins. His name was Henry VIII, and the curse he carried wasn't just personal, it was hereditary. 2. Henry VIII's cursed bloodline. For a man who split the entire English church in two just to secure a male heir, Henry VIII was suspiciously unlucky when it came to producing one. He had 6 wives. 6. The math alone raises eyebrows. But the real scandal isn't that Henry cycled through women like seasonal court fashions. It's that none of them, except one, could give him a son who lived. Miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who died within weeks, and in one case, a healthy boy who would eventually inherit the crown, only to waste away before his 16th birthday. If Henry's obsession was continuity, fate had a darker sense of humour. For centuries, historians chalked it up to bad luck, divine punishment, or the whims of biology. But modern science has introduced a far more unsettling possibility. What if the real curse was Henry himself? Enter the Kell antigen, a rare blood condition found in about 9% of the population, where a person who is Kell positive can trigger a deadly immune response in their partner's pregnancies. If the mother is Kell negative, essentially the first child might survive, but each subsequent pregnancy is attacked by the mother's immune system, mistaking the fetus for an invader. The results? A grim pattern of miscarriages and infant deaths. Sound familiar? Henry may have carried the Kell antigen, and if that's true, then his wives, almost certainly Kell negative, were not failing him. He was failing them. But in a court where women were blamed for everything from weak tea to dying heirs, Henry's pride was always insulated. It was easier, politically and emotionally, to burn through wives than face the mirror. Catherine of Aragon bore him a daughter, Mary, but no surviving sons. Anne Boleyn gave birth to Elizabeth, then miscarried a male fetus. Jane Seymour finally bore him a son, Edward VI, who became king but was a sickly child and died young. The remaining wives fared little better. 2 were discarded, 1 executed, 1 outlived him, likely with a quiet sigh of relief. Even more chilling is the possibility that Henry may have suffered from MacLeod syndrome, a rare genetic disorder that appears later in life and affects both muscle function and cognitive stability. The disease is associated with the Kell blood group. Symptoms? Paranoia, rage, memory loss, and violent mood swings. Now think about the Henry who imprisoned 2 of his wives, executed 1, accused courtiers of treason on a dime, and grew increasingly erratic in his later years. He wasn't just aging, he may have been unraveling. Contemporary reports describe Henry as once athletic, brilliant, charismatic, a golden prince. But by his 40s, he was obese, volatile, and deeply suspicious. The change was so stark that it spawned folklore, curses, poison, witchcraft. But if his deterioration was genetic, not moral or mystical, the real horror is this: Henry didn't break the world because of politics. He broke it because of something entirely beyond his control. and entirely inherited. And what did the Tudor dynasty inherit from all this? A daughter, Elizabeth I, who became one of the most powerful monarchs in British history, but who never married and never had children. A son, Edward VI, who died before he could grow into the role. And Mary I, whose reign was defined by failed pregnancies and national trauma. The bloodline burned bright, then fizzled. If the crown were a torch, Henry passed it soaked in kerosene. And it's not that the flame went out, it's that no one could hold it for long without getting burned. But here's where things take a turn toward the poetic. Because while the official records fixate on Henry's line, his genetic damage may have reached further than his immediate family. Quietly, without anyone noticing at first, those same defects may have echoed through the interwoven royal bloodlines of Europe. Cousins married cousins. Nobility preserved their pure lineages like brittle antiques. And with each union, the gene pool shrank and the problems multiplied. The Habsburg jaw, the fragile czars, the Spanish royals with jaws too stiff to eat properly. They were all, in some twisted way, blood relatives, and the roots of that degeneration may have been seeded in part by Henry, his antigen, his obsessions, and his blind ambition to beat nature at its own game. But nature doesn't take bribes, and when it strikes back, it doesn't do it loudly. It whispers, it repeats, it erodes. One by one, royal families across Europe began suffering eerily similar fates. Mysterious illnesses, infant mortality, mental instability. The monarchy's greatest enemy wasn't rebellion or war, it was biology, and they never saw it coming. Of course, one king did see something coming, or at least he saw something no one else could. His name was George III. And when he began talking to trees and writing sentences that ran for pages, people called it madness. But madness, like monarchy, tends to run in the family. If your mind's already spinning and we're only 2 secrets in, you're in the right place. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming next, because it only gets stranger from here. And while you're at it, tell us in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it right now? Are you unraveling royal mysteries at 2 a.m. or is it a midday descent into madness? 3. The madness of King George III. He talked to angels. He rambled in 7 languages. He shook hands with oak trees because he believed they were long-lost relatives, and for over 50 years he ruled Great Britain. That in itself may be the most English sentence ever written. George III wasn't a tyrant in the traditional sense. He didn't start wars for fun. He didn't behead wives, he didn't steal thrones or disappear nephews into towers. His reign was long, loyal, and, at least in the beginning, stable. He even planted trees with his own hands, a king more fond of farming than of conquest. But by the end, he was babbling nonsense under lock and key, while his son ruled as regent. The polite explanation, madness. The more clinical term, porphyria, a rare genetic condition that affects the nervous system and can lead to hallucinations, paranoia, and severe physical symptoms. Some historians argue George's madness was in fact a biochemical breakdown triggered by stress, inherited through generations and tragically misunderstood by the 18th century physicians who tried to cure it with leeches and cold baths. But madness is never just medical in a royal family. It's a scandal wrapped in silk. It's a state secret with a crown on its head. So while George III slowly unraveled behind palace walls, Parliament invented new titles and ceremonial scripts to cover it up. The king was indisposed, then unwell, then unable to receive ministers. Eventually, they just gave up and let his son, the future George IV, take over while pretending everything was fine. This wasn't a one-off tragedy. It was part of a pattern, one that ran like a hairline fracture through the Hanoverian dynasty. His great-grandfather George I had locked his wife in a remote castle and may have had a mistress murdered. His grandfather, George II, died in a rather undignified fashion, details of which we'll skip, but trust that they involved internal pressure and a bathroom. Even George III's own descendants weren't spared. His son, George IV, was an extravagant mess. His granddaughter, Queen Victoria, would later carry a different genetic legacy, hemophilia, but the roots of instability had already set in. If porphyria was the cause of George III's breakdown, it came with some bitter ironies. The condition is often triggered by stress and changes in diet. George, being a man of peculiar virtue, abstained from many indulgences of his era, alcohol, gambling, affairs. He loved his wife, Charlotte. He adored his 15 children, though they did not return the favor in equal measure. The very things that might have kept his blood pressure low instead seemed to incubate something darker. In trying to be a moral king, he may have quickened his own unraveling. But here's the twist. His so-called madness didn't destroy his reign. In fact, it lasted longer than any monarch before Queen Victoria. He saw off revolutions. He lost the American colonies, yes, but managed to keep his crown and his nation intact during an age of unprecedented upheaval. What does that say about power? That a man who once mistook a hay bale for the Archbishop of Canterbury could still rule the most powerful empire in the world? It says the monarchy even then was less about control than performance. And George's decline was a threat not just to his own image, but to the illusion that the crown always knew what it was doing. And there's something else. Porphyria can be inherited. If George had it, the gene may have flowed through his many children and grandchildren, some of whom suffered from nervous afflictions that went politely unmentioned in biographies. There's even evidence that it reached into the 20th century, possibly affecting Edward VIII, whose abdication would later spark constitutional crisis. Not because he was mad, but because he made choices so reckless, so emotionally erratic, they bore the fingerprints of something deeper than scandal. But perhaps the most haunting moment of George III's life was not his descent, but his recovery. In 1789, after months of hallucinations, seizures, and verbal chaos, he suddenly improved. For a brief window, the light came back on. His speeches made sense. His memory returned. His family rejoiced. Parliament cancelled the Regency Bill. And then, slowly, inevitably, it returned. For the final decade of his life, George was kept out of sight, blind, deaf, and lost in his own mind, while others ruled in his name, a living monarch, a political ghost. Proof that the crown can survive anything, even if the person wearing it cannot. But in the royal bloodline, suffering rarely travels alone. Illnesses hide inside legacies. And just as one king wasted away in silence, another prince, his long-dead ancestor, had already withered from something equally mysterious. His name was Edward. History remembers him as the Black Prince, and despite his legendary victories, his greatest battle was the one no one ever saw. 4. The Black Prince's hidden illness. His armor was black, his banner black, his nickname also black, but his reputation pure gold, at least at first glance. Edward of Woodstock, better known to history as the Black Prince, was the eldest son of King Edward III and the golden heir to England's medieval might. He was everything a chivalric fantasy could hope for. Tall, commanding, born in a thunderstorm, and seemingly bred for war. At just 16, he led troops at the Battle of Crécy and crushed the French so thoroughly that even enemy chroniclers called him the flower of chivalry. He was England's great hope, a prince forged in battle, worshipped by his men, feared by his enemies, and destined to be king. And yet, he never wore the crown. Edward died in 1376, just 1 year before his father, leaving behind a child who would become Richard II. His death shocked the court, the country, the continent, but more than that, it confused them, because Edward wasn't killed in battle. He wasn't assassinated, exiled, or poisoned. No, the Black Prince, the most powerful warrior of his generation, simply wasted away. Historical records are maddeningly vague. Some say he suffered from a slow fever. Others mention a flux, a medieval term as unhelpful as it is ominous. There were murmurs of chronic dysentery possibly caught during campaigns in Spain, but the timeline doesn't add up. The symptoms went on for years. Fevers, weakness, swelling, skin discoloration. His decline was so gradual it defied all logic for a man once considered indestructible. Modern medical historians have floated various diagnoses: multiple sclerosis, Crohn's disease, tuberculosis, even Hodgkin's lymphoma. But none fit perfectly. It's like chasing a ghost through a hospital ward. One theory, however, stands out, not because it solves the riddle, but because it deepens it: genetic illness. If Edward's deterioration stemmed from a hereditary condition, the implications ripple far beyond his own fate. It would mean that, baked into the royal line of England, just 2 generations after the end of the Plantagenet civil wars, was a vulnerability not visible in portraits or pageants, a hidden weakness dressed in chainmail and praised in poetry. And yet it wasn't just physical decline that surrounded Edward, it was symbolic. His victories in battle were undeniable, but his campaigns in Aquitaine and Castile became quagmires. The glory faded, his alliances broke down, his once mythic image began to tarnish, just as his body did. A man who had been hailed as the reincarnation of King Arthur returned to England a shell of himself, gaunt, drained, and visibly deteriorating. During his final years, he struggled to perform even basic ceremonial duties. Courtiers whispered, priests offered ambiguous prayers, physicians bled him, dosed him, bathed him in oils. Nothing worked. He lingered in the shadows of Westminster like a ghost in waiting. Then, just like that, he was gone. 36 years old, younger than most of his enemies, older than most of his victories. But the real consequence of Edward's early death wasn't personal, it was dynastic. With him died the most competent successor England had seen in a century. In his place came his 10-year-old son, Richard II, who would later become a symbol of weak rule and political disaster. Had Edward lived, England's descent into the Wars of the Roses might have been delayed or avoided entirely. Instead, the fragile balance of power cracked and the Plantagenet line spiraled into one of the bloodiest civil conflicts in European history. It's poetic in the darkest sense. The very prince who could have prevented the royal house from tearing itself apart may have carried the very illness that doomed it. Even in death, the Black Prince was treated with the kind of reverence usually reserved for emperors. His tomb at Canterbury Cathedral is a marvel of Gothic beauty, with an effigy clad in black armour and a gilded inscription that reads more like a warrior's boast than a eulogy. But beneath that elegance lies a strange contradiction. He was celebrated for what he could have been, not what he was. He was the almost king, the prelude, the promise that never matured. And in that sense, his story set a quiet precedent. Royals who were broken inside, but propped up by myth. A narrative thread that would appear again and again and again, because for all the might and glory the monarchy projected, the rot often started from within. Take, for instance, James I, another heir surrounded by suspicion and oddities. His ascent to the English throne was hailed as a unifying miracle, but behind that pageantry was a lingering, unspeakable doubt. Was he even who he claimed to be, or was the man who inherited both crowns the product of something far more scandalous than politics? A birth, a rumour, and a royal bloodline with more questions than answers. 5. James I's questionable parentage. When James VI of Scotland became James I of England in 1603, it was sold to the public as a moment of divine continuity. One crown uniting 2 nations, the Virgin Queen dead, the Stuart King ascendant. It was marketed with biblical flair, peace, prophecy, and providence. But peel back the carefully gilded narrative, and the story becomes far less tidy. because long before he sat on the English throne, James carried a peculiar shadow. It trailed him through childhood, followed him to the Scottish court, and never quite left him, even after he wore the crown of both realms. It was a whisper, quiet, persistent, and royally inconvenient. What if James wasn't really the son of Lord Darnley? On paper, James was born in June 1566 to Mary, Queen of Scots, and her husband Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. The marriage was a political nightmare from the start, volatile, suspicious, and short-lived. Darnley was arrogant, unstable, and quickly became more liability than asset. He also had a knack for making enemies, both inside and outside the bedroom. Just 8 months after James's birth, Darnley was dead, blown up in an explosion at Kirker Field. His body was found in a garden nearby, curiously untouched by the blast, but dead nonetheless. The official story wobbled from the beginning. Assassins, a lover's plot, Mary's involvement, all of the above. The truth was buried as quickly as Darnley was, and Mary's position collapsed soon after. She married the chief suspect in Darnley's murder, was forced to abdicate, and fled to England, leaving her infant son to be raised by Protestant lords in a cold Scottish court. A boy king, barely a year old, now a pawn in a violent theological chess match. But here's where it gets strange. Darnley's behaviour in the months leading up to James's birth was erratic, dangerously so. He had begun accusing Mary of infidelity, claiming the child wasn't his. His paranoia was dismissed at the time as the ravings of a jealous drunk, but the accusations stuck. The timing of the pregnancy was close, but not suspiciously so. Still, the question lingered. Was there someone else? Some pointed to David Rizzio, Mary's Italian secretary, a favourite at court, and a man Darnley had publicly despised. Rizzio was murdered in front of Mary, stabbed dozens of times while she was pregnant with James. Darnley had a hand in that killing too, which certainly did not help his marital case, but others suggested more obscure names, nobles, courtiers, even foreign envoys. The conspiracy doesn't hinge on any one name. It hinges on the idea that James was not his father's son, and if he wasn't, then his claim to both the Scottish and English thrones was technically void. Of course, no one dared say it aloud once he became king. Not in England, at least, but in Scotland and across Europe, the rumour had legs. Catholic factions who never accepted Elizabeth I's legitimacy used the tale to discredit James, arguing that the true heir lay elsewhere, possibly among the exiled Catholic branches of the Stuart line, or even deeper into continental aristocracy. And James himself? He responded to the gossip with silence. Publicly, he honoured his mother's memory, but privately, he rarely mentioned her. He commissioned no grand portraits of Darnley, no effusive speeches. He ruled with a sense of entitlement, but also with the insecurity of a man who knew just how fragile his claim really was. It didn't help that James was an odd fit for England. He lacked Elizabeth's stage presence. He spoke with a thick accent, walked with a limp, and surrounded himself with sycophants and male favourites. His court was infamous for its chaos. His manners were eccentric at best. He had a mind for theology, a nose for books, and a complete misunderstanding of how to charm the English elite. Still, he was clever. He understood the power of narrative. He knew that monarchies aren't built on blood, they're built on belief. And if enough people believe you're legitimate, you are. But belief is a fragile thing. The same way a king's bloodline can be questioned, so too can his mother's reputation, his father's death, and his own right to rule. The idea that a child born in scandal, raised in exile, and seated on 2 thrones could escape the gravitational pull of his origins is optimistic at best. And it would not be the last time a Tudor-turned-Stuart child would be wrapped in rumours of identity, legitimacy, or strange birthmarks. In fact, the next royal woman in our story would find herself whispered about long after her death, not because of her politics, but because of her hands. A queen consort, a mother, a warning, and possibly a witch. 6. Anne Boleyn's sixth finger rumour. By the time Anne Boleyn lost her head in 1536, her legend had already taken on a life of its own. She was the woman who broke a kingdom in half, the seductress who dethroned a queen, the mother of a future icon, and the downfall of a king's patience. But while the official charges against her included adultery, incest, and high treason, none of which were ever proven, the most enduring accusation was not legal, but anatomical. They said she had a sixth finger. The claim didn't surface until after her death, and even then, it came through gossip more than documentation. Nicholas Sander, a Catholic recusant writing decades later, claimed that Anne had a projecting tooth under the upper lip, a large wen on her neck, and, most famously, a sixth finger on one hand. That small detail, the extra digit, became the centerpiece of a symbolic campaign against her. It wasn't just about deformity. It was about sin, otherness, and the suggestion that Anne Boleyn was unnatural, perhaps even touched by the devil himself. But there's a problem. No contemporary of Anne's mentioned such a feature, not the courtiers who watched her dance at mask balls, not the artists who painted her, not the men who lusted after her, betrayed her, or died for her. Nothing. It appears suddenly, decades later, like a stain invented to justify a mess. Still, the rumour stuck. It played into every convenient fear about Anne, that she had bewitched Henry VIII, that her rise was unnatural, that her seduction was something more than charm, it was sorcery. Because how else do you explain a woman who arrived at court with no noble title, no exceptional beauty by contemporary standards, and yet managed to displace a queen, trigger a reformation, and make a king defy the Pope? The answer for many was simple: witchcraft, and the sixth finger became the physical proof of a metaphysical crime. But let's rewind. Anne was not a nobody. She came from the Boleyn family, a rising power with connections to the Howard clan, one of the most ambitious noble families in England. She was educated in the Netherlands and France, fluent in multiple languages, raised among queens and artists, and trained in the kind of courtly sophistication that most English ladies could only dream of. When she returned to England, she caught Henry's eye not with her looks, though she was considered striking, but with her intellect, wit, and unavailability. She refused to be his mistress. She refused him for years, and in doing so, she became indispensable. Henry began writing her letters, dozens, passionate, rambling, worshipful letters, more than he ever wrote to any other woman. He promised her everything, and in the end, he delivered: a crown, a coronation, a throne. But the crown was a curse. Once she was queen, Anne was expected to do the one thing no English queen could fail at: bear a male heir. She gave birth to Elizabeth in 1533, an extraordinary child, but the wrong gender in Henry's eyes. After that came miscarriages. The second one, historians now believe, may have been a son. That was the beginning of the end. By 1536, Henry had already begun eyeing Jane Seymour, and Anne, once the irresistible flame, was now an uncomfortable mirror, a reflection of the gamble Henry had made and lost. So they built a case. The charges were ridiculous: affairs with multiple men, including her own brother. Confessions were extracted through torture, through fear, through invention. Her fall was theatrical, swift, and final. And once she was dead, the myths began to bloom. A sixth finger? It was never about digits. It was about distancing. Making Anne monstrous after the fact allowed everyone, Henry, his court, his clergy, to distance themselves from the chaos she had caused. If she was deformed, unnatural, unholy, then her rise was a cosmic accident, and her death a necessary correction. The witch rumours were retroactive moral justification, and in a perverse way they succeeded. Anne's name became shorthand for female ambition run amok, a woman who aimed too high, who challenged too many, who asked too much, and who paid for it with her life. But if her enemies thought they had erased her legacy, they miscalculated. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would go on to become one of the most powerful monarchs in English history. The very daughter who came from the womb of a woman branded unnatural. That's the thing about legacies, they're rarely what we plan. And blood, no matter how cursed or questioned, has a habit of enduring. Of course, the question of blood was never far from the Tudors. It clung to them like a second skin, because behind the grand marriages and golden portraits, the truth was far more tangled. This was a family already sewn together by cousins, stitched by strategy, and slowly strangled by their own pedigree. And nowhere was that more obvious than in the private anatomy of the Tudor family tree, a structure so dense with inbreeding that even the roots began to rot. 7. Elizabeth I's virginity. She wore pearls like armor and kept her heart in a vault. She signed letters as your humble servant, though she commanded fleets, and she died officially a virgin, or so they say. Elizabeth I, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the last Tudor monarch, built her myth like a fortress. Virginity, in her case, wasn't just a personal state, it was policy, propaganda, a protective shield of sanctity that wrapped itself around a nation. England, in her reign, was both kingdom and consort. No husband, no children, no heirs, just power, unshared and indivisible. But for all the portraits of her as the untouchable celestial body, radiant in gold, surrounded by symbols of purity, the rumors never stopped, because when a queen claims to be beyond the reach of earthly love, the world begins searching for fingerprints. Let's start with Robert Dudley, childhood friend, master of the horse, favorite of the queen. He was always there, at court, at her side, in her thoughts. When his wife, Amy Robsart, died under suspicious circumstances, a fall down a staircase, of course, the whispers became roars. Elizabeth was unmarried, emotionally entangled, and suddenly very available. Yet she refused to wed him. Why? To marry Dudley would have compromised her power. To not marry him inflamed the gossip. Some courtiers believed she was already secretly his. Some believed she was physically incapable of intimacy. Others thought she was a cunning manipulator who used the idea of potential marriage as diplomatic leverage without ever intending to follow through. But beyond Dudley, the list of supposed lovers reads like a who's who of Tudor court theatre. Francis Drake, Walter Raleigh, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, whose execution she later sanctioned, though not without tears. Each man adored her, or claimed to. Each man, at some point, was believed to have shared something with the Queen that history could never quite prove. The most persistent theory, that Elizabeth did, in fact, have secret liaisons, but her circle was so tight, so loyal, and so aware of the consequences that no one ever talked. She was surrounded by women, ladies-in-waiting who slept near her chambers, and men who owed their careers to her discretion. The court itself was part political machine, part cult. To betray the Queen was to betray the crown. And so, silence reigned. But then there's the Bisley Boy theory, a tale so strange it sounds like satire until you realize how long it's endured. The story goes like this. As a child, Elizabeth was sent away during a plague outbreak to the village of Bisley. While there, she died suddenly. In a panic, and fearing the wrath of King Henry VIII, her caretakers found a local boy who resembled her, dressed him as Elizabeth, and passed him off as the real princess. According to this theory, the boy remained in the role, returned to court, and, through a combination of good schooling, intense secrecy, and absurdly high stakes, became Queen of England. This would, the theorists say, explain her refusal to marry, her alleged androgyny, her skill in languages, her thin, reedy voice, her refusal to allow physicians near her body even in illness. Of course, the theory collapses under serious scrutiny. There were too many witnesses, too many letters, too many people who'd known Elizabeth from birth. But like all enduring conspiracy theories, it speaks not to fact but to feeling. Because at the heart of the Virgin Queen myth is a paradox. Elizabeth was both hyper-visible and personally unknowable. Her body was a battlefield, symbolic, politicized, scrutinized. Yet her private life was a locked room with no windows. No one knew what went on behind her chamber doors. That was the point. And maybe that's why the mystery of her virginity persists. Not because people care whether or not she had sex, but because they still don't understand how she wielded such absolute power without letting anyone close enough to take it from her. In a world where queens were supposed to be wives first, Elizabeth was the inversion, a monarch first always. Her virginity was a metaphor, whether it was real or not. It meant she belonged to no one, not Rome, not Spain, not any man. But what if that independence came at a cost? What if the very thing that made her powerful, her distance, her mystique, also made her dynasty untenable? She left no heir, no family, no continuation, just silence after her final breath. And so the Tudors ended as strangely as they began, in rumour, contradiction, and bloodlines wrapped too tightly around themselves. But Elizabeth's carefully constructed isolation wasn't just political. It may have also been practical, because the Tudor bloodline had already begun to show cracks, not in public scandals, but in private losses, miscarriages, stillbirths, a pattern of children who didn't survive the womb. And the deeper historians dig, the more it looks like something wasn't just off, it was hereditary. 8. The inbreeding of the Tudors. The Tudors were many things: opportunists, reformers, tyrants, visionaries. But above all, they were careful. Careful with their image, their alliances, and most of all, their blood. On the surface, Tudor England looks like a celebration of strong rule and dynastic glory. But beneath the gilded portraits and grand processions, the dynasty was held together with a dangerously thin strand of DNA. The family tree wasn't so much a branching organism as a slowly curling vine, coiling around itself with each successive generation. Because when your claim to power rests entirely on who your ancestors were, marrying outside the family starts to feel like a threat. So they didn't. Or rather, they did, just rarely, and only within the acceptable range of noble blood. And it was that obsessive control over breeding that began to turn the Tudor dynasty from a story of success into a cautionary tale of inherited decline. Let's go back to the beginning. When Henry VII seized the throne in 1485, he did it not as a widely beloved heir, but as the last man standing in a country exhausted by civil war. His claim was so tenuous that he married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV and niece of Richard III, just to make it look like divine destiny. Their union was presented as the healing of England's deep wounds, a symbolic fusion of the houses of Lancaster and York. But what it really did was double down on one particular royal lineage. Their children were as purely royal as anyone could hope for, and also just a little too genetically familiar. Their son, Henry VIII, inherited the throne with all the swagger of a man convinced his blood was gold-plated. He married 6 times, but his obsession with a male heir may have had less to do with sexism and more to do with subtle creeping awareness that something in his bloodline wasn't right. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, came from the deeply interbred Habsburg dynasty. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, first cousins once removed. The Habsburgs were famous for consolidating power through intra-family marriage. They were also infamous for their protruding jaws, clubbed feet, and worrying infant mortality rates. Catherine's own family tree is a web of repeats, names that occur more than once, generations where cousin and spouse were often the same person. Catherine and Henry had 6 children together. 1 survived, Mary. The rest were miscarriages, stillbirths, or died within weeks. A pattern that repeated itself with Anne Boleyn, with Jane Seymour, and even with the few mistresses Henry acknowledged publicly. Modern historians suspect Henry may have carried the Kell-positive antigen, a rare blood type that, when passed to a child through a Kell-negative mother, can trigger an immune response. The first child often survives. The next ones? Rejected by the mother's immune system. It would explain why so many of his queens had similar reproductive outcomes, but it doesn't end there. The three children who did survive, Mary, Elizabeth and Edward, each carried their own version of the Tudor curse. Edward VI, born to Jane Seymour, became king at 9 and was dead by 15. Frail, sickly and likely suffering from tuberculosis or some form of congenital disorder, he was never healthy. Mary I suffered from chronic illnesses, phantom pregnancies and deep emotional instability. Elizabeth I was strong but sterile. 3 monarchs, 0 heirs. It wasn't just bad luck, it was genetic gravity. And though the Tudors didn't breed within their immediate family in the most literal sense, the narrowing of acceptable noble blood meant that every marriage, alliance or flirtation was pulling from the same shallow gene pool. By the end of the dynasty, there was simply no one left to carry the line. The issue wasn't visible deformities, it was deeper, subtle. It showed up in the womb, in the sickbed, in the early graves of infants never baptized. The court physicians tried to explain it. Priests called it divine punishment. Henry blamed his wives, but the truth was buried in the blood. Which brings us to a broader problem. This wasn't just a Tudor issue. This was a royal issue. The desire to protect the bloodline, to keep it noble and clean, had the opposite effect. It concentrated mutations, it repeated risks, it doubled down on fragility. In chasing strength, they created weakness. And while Henry VIII burned through wives and dissolved monasteries in his desperation for a son, one of his successors would take a different route. Instead of multiplying his heirs, he multiplied his lovers, because if the official lineage was broken, maybe the unofficial one could take root in the shadows. A king with no legitimate heirs, but a legacy spread through back doors, smoky corridors, and whispered titles. Enter Charles II, the man who fathered at least 14 children, none of them royal, all of them his. 9. Charles II's 14 illegitimate children. Charles II came back from exile with nothing, no crown, no legitimacy, no clear future. But he returned with something far more potent than policy, charm. And if kingship had anything to do with personal magnetism, then Charles ruled like a comet, dazzling, untouchable, and prone to leaving scorched trails behind him. He was crowned in 1660, after the grim grey interlude of the English Commonwealth collapsed under its own weight. The monarchy had returned, and with it came a new kind of king, one who wasn't interested in martyrdom or divine destiny, but in living, deeply, widely, and on his own terms. Charles had seen his father executed by Parliament. He had fled across Europe, wandered the courts of Catholic monarchs, begged for funds, flirted with nuns, and dined with spies. By the time he wore the English crown, he was already a legend, but not notably a husband. Not really. Charles married Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess who brought with her a rich dowry and a polite personality. What she didn't bring, through no fault of her own, was an heir. The marriage was politically smart, personally civil, and biologically fruitless. Catherine suffered multiple miscarriages. Their union produced no surviving children, and that opened the door for Charles's true dynasty, the one scribbled in the margins of royal history. Because while the official line ended with his death, his other family continued. Charles fathered at least 14 illegitimate children with 7 different women. Those are just the ones that made it into polite conversation. Some were acknowledged publicly, some were denied with a smirk, and all were born into a royal paradox, genetically close to the throne, but legally barred from touching it. Let's name a few, because history tends to forget them, even as their descendants married into every aristocratic family in Britain. James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, perhaps the most famous of Charles's illegitimate sons, born to Lucy Walter. Handsome, ambitious, and dangerously popular, Monmouth eventually tried to claim the throne after Charles's death, sparking a doomed rebellion and losing his head in the process. Charles FitzCharles, son of a Spanish noblewoman who died young but not before earning the nickname Don Carlo. Charlotte Lee, daughter of Barbara Villiers, one of Charles's most notorious mistresses. Barbara, elevated to the title of Duchess of Cleveland, had several children with Charles and wielded more influence than most ministers. Charles Lennox, Duke of Richmond, whose descendants include Princess Diana and, yes, Meghan Markle, proof that illegitimacy has a way of circling back into the fold. Charles Beauclerk, Duke of St. Albans, son of the actress Nell Gwynn, perhaps the most beloved of all Charles's mistresses. When their son was ennobled, the gossip columns of the day nearly imploded. Charles had a sense of humour about it. All when a bishop once scolded him for his promiscuity, the king famously replied, "I am the last man to judge anyone for having bastards. I've got quite a few myself." It was typical of Charles, witty, self-aware, and deeply disinterested in pretending to be something he wasn't. And yet, his string of mistresses and illegitimate children served a deeper function than just pleasure or distraction. They were political assets. Each child was a pawn, each mistress a potential alliance. Nobles were elevated, debts repaid, loyalty secured. Royal blood became currency, valuable, symbolic, and strategically distributed. But here's the dark irony. For all the genetic abundance Charles provided, none of it solved the one problem he couldn't outrun: succession. When Charles died in 1685, the crown passed to his brother James II, not to any of his many sons, and James's reign would prove catastrophic. Religious tension, absolutist leanings, and the birth of a Catholic heir led to the Glorious Revolution and the end of the Stuart male line on the English throne. The monarchy passed to outsiders, eventually looping back through the Hanoverian imports. Charles's legitimate line, if it could be called that, died with him. His blood, however, did not. His descendants, through the Fitzroys, the Beauclerks, the Richmonds, still move through the veins of Britain's upper class. Some married into nobility, some into scandal, some even back into royalty, like echoes returning from a century gone sideways. Charles II may not have left a direct heir, but he left something far more chaotic, a dynasty without a crown. A royal line dispersed into the shadows, a kingdom of half-princes and quiet dowries, of dukes with awkward surnames and houses that still carry portraits of a smiling, dark-eyed king who gave them everything except legitimacy. And maybe that's what makes his legacy so unsettling. Charles proved that a king's power doesn't end at the borders of marriage or law. It seeps, it lingers, it populates. But what if those heirs, those unofficial continuations, also carried something else with them? A sickness, a curse, a flaw in the very blood they were so proud to inherit. Because Charles's father, grandfather, and great-grandfather had all shown signs of something strange, not political madness, but something biological. Something that flickered under the skin and boiled quietly in the bloodline. The name for it would come much later. They'd call it porphyria. 10. The Royal Porphyria Curse. Long before medical science had a name for it, the British royal family had a reputation for it. They called it eccentricity, weak nerves, melancholy, divine punishment. The polite terms used to patch over something far less poetic: recurring, unexplained madness that seemed to pass not just through generations, but through crowns. And then, centuries later, someone finally gave it a name: porphyria. A rare metabolic disorder, inherited, chronic, capable of triggering everything from abdominal pain and muscle weakness to hallucinations, insomnia, paranoia, and full psychotic episodes. A disease of the blood, specifically of the body's ability to produce heme, a component of hemoglobin. It doesn't sound regal, but it might explain a great deal about the royal bloodline. The most famous suspected case, of course, is King George III, whose reign crumbled under prolonged periods of mental collapse. His symptoms included garbled speech, insomnia, hypersensitivity to noise, purple-tinged urine, a telltale sign, and a disintegration of rational thought. For years, his madness was considered a tragic personal affliction, or worse, a punchline. But in the 1960s, researchers proposed a theory that shocked historians. George's breakdowns may have been caused by porphyria. And not just him, the condition is hereditary, which means if George III had it, others before and after him likely did too. The proposed trail begins with Mary, Queen of Scots, James I's mother, and George III's great-great-grandmother. Mary herself was imprisoned and executed for reasons more political than medical, but her son James I was known for his erratic behavior, chronic pain, and hypersensitivity. He also exhibited signs of paranoia, sudden mood swings, and a near-obsessive fear of poison and assassination. Then there's Queen Anne, who suffered 17 pregnancies, only one of which resulted in a child who lived past infancy, and even he died young. Anne's health was fragile, her body swollen, her mind frequently clouded. Some historians suspect that porphyria may have played a role in both her physical and reproductive difficulties. Even Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, son of Princess Anne, is suspected to have suffered from inherited illness, his development delayed, his body deformed, his life cut short before he could inherit the throne. These weren't isolated cases. They were data points scattered across the tapestry of British royalty, hinting at a shared underlying defect. Still, porphyria remained invisible to the 18th century eye. Physicians of the time prescribed bleeding, purging, ice baths and leeches. The cure was often worse than the disease. Sufferers were dismissed as weak, immoral, or unhinged. Monarchs could lose their thrones not because of a coup or a war, but because their blood was quietly attacking their minds. And yet, these kings and queens continued to reign. They signed decrees. They arranged marriages. They declared wars and funded voyages and executed traitors, all while managing symptoms that today would merit hospitalization. Because in the monarchy, appearance mattered more than function, but the royal obsession with blood wasn't just metaphorical, it was literal. Monarchs married to preserve bloodlines, to reinforce noble genetics. Ironically, this very obsession may have intensified the problem. By intermarrying within the same narrow pool of European aristocracy, other royal houses who likely carried the same mutations, the risk of inherited disorders multiplied. So when George III began to deteriorate, when his sentences grew longer and more nonsensical, when his nights stretched into sleepless rants and his days into delusions, the palace response was not treatment. It was containment. Lock the king in Windsor, silence the press, empower the Prince of Wales as regent, pretend nothing is wrong. Because when a monarch is mad, the monarchy itself begins to look mad. And no one in the kingdom, least of all the monarchy, could afford that. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the porphyria theory is how quietly it could hide. The disease doesn't strike everyone with equal force. It can remain dormant for years, triggered only by stress, medication, or even diet. One generation may exhibit violent symptoms, the next only mild discomfort. In a family line as long and labyrinthine as Britain's royals, that makes it the perfect curse. Invisible, unpredictable, and politically disastrous. And even if porphyria wasn't the only cause of royal instability, it created just enough chaos to destabilize successions, warp public perception, and haunt royal reputations. It turned kings into patients, heirs into liabilities, and blood into a ticking clock. By the time modern science started catching up, the damage was already done. The gene, if it was there, had already woven itself deep into the royal tapestry, passed silently from chamber to chamber, cradle to cradle. And perhaps, still today, it lingers, hidden beneath good breeding and better PR. A quiet inheritance no coronation can erase. Of course, the whisper of porphyria is just one note in a much older, louder song. The one where royal lineage is constantly questioned, because for some kings and queens, it wasn't just madness or sickness that threatened their claim. It was something even more dangerous: infidelity. And no case of royal paternity doubt ever cast a longer shadow than that of Mary, Queen of Scots, a queen whose son would inherit a throne, but perhaps not her husband's blood. 11. Mary, Queen of Scots' possible infidelity. The life of Mary, Queen of Scots, reads like a Gothic tragedy performed on a European stage, filled with doomed love, political betrayal, religious war, and perhaps most damning of all, a whisper that her only child was never her husband's. Born in 1542, Mary ascended the Scottish throne at just 6 days old, after the death of her father, James V. Her reign was immediately steeped in instability. Scotland, torn between Catholic and Protestant factions, was hardly a comfortable place for a young Catholic queen, so she was sent to France, raised in luxury, and married the Dauphin, becoming Queen of France for a fleeting moment before being widowed at 18. When she returned to Scotland, it wasn't as a queen confident in her sovereignty. It was as a young woman caught between dynasties, trying to hold onto a crown balanced on knives. But for all her political missteps, and there were many, it was her second marriage that truly destroyed her. In 1565, Mary married her cousin, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. On paper, it was a politically sound move. Both had claims to the English throne through Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII. Their union was meant to unite and strengthen their position against Elizabeth I of England. In practice, it was a disaster. Darnley was handsome, arrogant, and profoundly insecure. He resented Mary's power, and worse, he wanted the crown matrimonial, meaning co-sovereignty of Scotland. When she refused, he lashed out. Their marriage quickly degenerated into public spectacle. Darnley drank heavily, plotted behind her back, and surrounded himself with sycophants. Then came the event that would etch itself into both history and conspiracy: the murder of David Rizzio. Rizzio, Mary's private secretary, was a foreigner, Italian, ambitious, charming. He had her ear and possibly more, depending on which chronicler you believe. Darnley believed Rizzio had too much influence. Some whispered that he believed Rizzio was the father of Mary's unborn child. So, in a scene almost too lurid for fiction, Darnley and a group of armed men stormed Mary's private supper chamber and stabbed Rizzio repeatedly right in front of her while she was visibly pregnant. This act, beyond its sheer brutality, planted a seed. If Darnley truly believed Rizzio was the father, who else believed it? And more importantly, was it true? 3 months later, Mary gave birth to a son, James. Darnley was acknowledged as the father. The child was baptized as a prince, and yet the rumors refused to die. James's features were scrutinized from infancy. Some said he looked nothing like Darnley. Others said he resembled Rizzio. Still others suggested that the child's very survival was suspicious, given the physical trauma Mary had endured. And in a world where legitimacy determined succession, even a sliver of doubt was enough to haunt a dynasty. What makes the theory hard to dismiss is what happened next. Darnley didn't survive the year. In 1567, his residence at Kirkerfield was destroyed by an explosion. His body, however, was found outside the rubble, unburned but dead. Some said he had been strangled or smothered. Others said he had fled the blast and collapsed. The official explanation was inconclusive, but the suspects were not hard to find. Chief among them, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, Mary's third husband, and the man she married just 3 months after Darnley's death. Public opinion turned against her almost overnight. Mary was imprisoned, forced to abdicate. Her infant son, James, was crowned King of Scotland. Mary fled to England, hoping for protection from her cousin Elizabeth I. Instead, she was held captive for 19 years and eventually executed. And what of James? Raised by Protestant lords in Scotland, James VI eventually inherited the English crown as James I after Elizabeth's death. His rule marked the beginning of the Stuart dynasty in England, but the questions surrounding his paternity lingered, if not in Parliament, then certainly in the margins of royal gossip. James was intelligent, deeply religious, and politically savvy, but also eccentric. He had a lifelong fear of being assassinated, an obsession with witchcraft, and a deep discomfort with women. His personality was complex, but some believed his strangeness hinted at murky origins. Was he truly the son of a Stuart prince, or the illegitimate child of an Italian secretary with unclear intentions? If he wasn't Darnley's son, then the entire Stuart claim to the English throne was built on a fabrication, and yet no one dared challenge it openly. Elizabeth had no children. The Tudor line was extinct. England needed a king, and James had the right last name, even if no one was entirely sure where that name had come from. Of course, royal bloodlines have always been a gamble, an elegant fiction held together by pageantry, prayer, and propaganda. And nowhere is that fiction more potent than in the case of Elizabeth's legacy, because her own identity had always been suspect, not just morally, but biologically. And if Mary's child was questioned for possibly being illegitimate, Elizabeth would one day be accused of not being a woman at all. 12. Edward VIII's Nazi sympathies. He was a king for less than a year, but Edward VIII managed to pack a lifetime of controversy into 325 days. The man who would abdicate the throne for the woman I love left behind a trail of tabloid-friendly drama, diplomatic headaches, and whispers that were never quite silenced. But of all the shadows that cling to Edward's brief reign, one stands darker than the rest: his disturbing admiration for Nazi Germany. It's a chapter the British monarchy would rather forget, and one they've spent the better part of a century trying to bury under romance and revisionism. But the evidence persists, stubborn and unsettling. Edward wasn't just a former king with bad judgment. He was a man who may have actively collaborated with Britain's enemies during one of the darkest periods in modern history. Let's rewind. Before he was king, Edward was already a problem. As Prince of Wales, he was charming, photogenic, and wildly popular with the public. But behind palace doors, he was restless, ill-prepared, and dismissive of duty. He hated paperwork, loved parties, and maintained an unapologetically lavish lifestyle. The press adored him, his parents less so. George V once reportedly said, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself in 12 months. He was off by only a few weeks. The scandal that forced Edward's abdication in 1936, the decision to marry the twice-divorced American Wallis Simpson, has been framed as a romantic tragedy. In truth, it was a constitutional crisis barely disguised as a love story. Wallis wasn't just an unsuitable bride, she was a political liability. And Edward's determination to make her queen consort threatened to shatter the fragile unity of the empire. When Edward stepped down, he became the Duke of Windsor. Exiled from the crown, but not from influence, he and Wallis began a leisurely European tour that, curiously, took them to Germany in 1937, where they were received like royalty by the Nazis. There are photos, smiling, handshaking, flag-waving photos. Edward and Wallis met with Adolf Hitler at Berghof. They visited Nazi youth camps. They toured factories, watched parades, and dined with high-ranking officials. Edward saluted German troops. Wallis wore designer gowns. The trip was diplomatically unauthorized and quietly condemned by the British government. But it wasn't just optics. Declassified files, uncovered decades later, suggest that Edward may have been in deeper than previously admitted. The infamous Marburg files, discovered in Germany after the war, included intercepted communications from Nazi officials discussing a potential Operation Willy, a plan to kidnap the Duke and Duchess and reinstate Edward as king in the event of a German invasion of Britain. The Nazis believed Edward could serve as a puppet monarch, sympathetic to their cause and willing to broker peace on their terms. Did Edward know about this? Was he involved? The answer is murky, but what's clear is that British intelligence took it seriously enough to keep Edward and Wallis parked in the Bahamas, far from Europe and even farther from power, for the rest of the war. Some historians argue that Edward's sympathies were more naive than treasonous, that he admired German efficiency, not ideology. Others suggest he saw Hitler as a buffer against Bolshevism. But even the most generous interpretations leave little room for comfort. Edward was not neutral. At best, he was reckless. At worst, he was complicit. The monarchy, desperate to preserve its image during the war, quickly distanced itself from the former king. His name was rarely mentioned in public. His actions were reframed as embarrassing, not dangerous. His file was buried in archives sealed for decades. When he died in 1972, his funeral was dignified but subdued. The crown he abandoned did not weep for him. And yet, the stain remains. Edward VIII wasn't just the king who gave it all up for love. He was the king who walked hand in hand with fascism while his country braced for war. A monarch who chose exile over duty and whose true legacy may lie not in what he lost, but in what he almost helped destroy. But he wasn't the only royal guilty of betrayal by silence, because while Edward was posing for photographs in Berghof, another royal figure was doing nothing at all. He didn't sign deals, he didn't shake hands, he didn't even leave his office. He simply said no when his cousins begged for asylum, fleeing the red tide of revolution. And in doing so, George V signed their death sentence. 13. George V's role in the Romanov murders. It was one of the coldest diplomatic decisions in British history, quietly made, quietly sealed, and horrifically irreversible. In 1917, as the Russian Empire crumbled under the weight of war, famine, and revolution, Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. Alongside his wife Alexandra and their 5 children, he was placed under house arrest. The Romanovs were Europe's oldest royal dynasty, and importantly, blood relatives of the British crown. Alexandra was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Nicholas and George V were first cousins. They looked so alike, they could have been twins in uniform. So naturally, when the Bolsheviks rose to power and the Romanovs' safety became uncertain, all eyes turned to London. Surely the British king would intervene. Surely George V would offer them asylum, and for a moment it looked like he would. The British government initially drafted a plan to bring the Romanovs to England, citing familial duty and humanitarian concern. The offer was whispered in telegrams and diplomatic cables, and then silence. Behind closed doors, George V had a change of heart. Concerned about his image, worried about domestic stability, and spooked by rising anti-monarchist sentiment in Britain, he rescinded the invitation, quietly. No public announcement, no explanation. The offer was simply withdrawn. The Romanovs, stranded in Russia, had nowhere else to go. Over the next year, they were shuffled between houses, guarded by increasingly radical troops, and subjected to ever tighter restrictions. Letters were censored, food became scarce, hope dwindled, and then, in July 1918, they were taken to a cellar in Ekaterinburg and executed. Nicholas, Alexandra, their daughters Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and their son Alexei by a Bolshevik firing squad. The execution was brutal. The aftermath, worse. For years, rumors swirled that one or more of the children had survived. Imposters emerged. Myths were born. But the truth remained. The British king could have saved them, and he didn't. George V's defenders argue that he was advised against offering asylum, that Britain, teetering from war, couldn't risk importing a deposed autocrat and his family, that his prime minister and cabinet feared riots, that the risk of socialist uprising was too high. But George wasn't just a constitutional monarch, he was family, and he chose political safety over blood. The choice haunted him. According to palace sources, he never spoke of it publicly again, but in private he mourned them. He commissioned memorials. He quietly supported Russian refugees. He read every intelligence update about the family's fate, even when the news was grim. But remorse, no matter how sincere, does not undo silence, and silence in royal history is often louder than screams. It was a pattern. Royals who could have intervened but chose not to. Kings who watched events unfold and convinced themselves that detachment was wisdom. Monarchs who stayed still while the world around them burned. And sometimes that silence wasn't about power, it was about shame. Because the next secret wasn't about politics, revolution, or diplomacy. It was about something the royals locked away in hospitals, in rural asylums, and in official documents stamped deceased. Even when the truth was that the women in question were very much alive, and they were the Queen Mother's own blood. 14. Elizabeth Boleyn's hidden nieces to the world, she was the Queen Mother, gracious, dutiful, serene, a symbol of wartime resilience and grandmotherly charm, photographed smiling in pearls, waving to crowds. But tucked behind her well-curated public image is a secret so disturbing, so quietly cruel, that it still feels too grotesque for the royal myth machine to fully acknowledge. In 1987, the British tabloid The Sun reported a story that, at the time, sounded too wild to be true, that two nieces of Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, daughters of her brother John Boleyn, had been secretly institutionalized and declared dead. Not metaphorically dead, legally, as in their names were listed in Burke's Peerage, the authoritative directory of the British aristocracy, as having died in the 1940s. In reality, they were very much alive. The two women, Nerissa and Catherine Boleyn, had been born with severe developmental disabilities. In an era that had neither the understanding nor the compassion to deal with cognitive impairments, they were quietly removed from public life. In 1941, both were committed to the Royal Earlswood Hospital for Mental Defectives in Redhill, Surrey, and there they remained. For decades, their family never visited. Their identities were never publicly acknowledged. They lived and died in anonymity, treated by staff and fellow patients as nameless wards. And all the while, the royal family, who could have ensured their care, comfort, and dignity, pretended they no longer existed. The question is not whether this was an act of cruelty. It was. The real question is why. The official explanation, if you can call it that, is rooted in the brutal eugenic thinking of the early 20th century. The royal family, like much of the British upper class, was obsessed with appearances, both physical and genetic. Mental disability, in this worldview, was not a condition but a stain, something shameful, embarrassing, and above all inconvenient. And so the nieces were erased. In Burke's Peerage, Nerissa was listed as having died in 1940, Catherine in 1961. In reality, Nerissa died in 1986, aged 66, and was buried in a pauper's grave marked only by a plastic tag and a serial number. Catherine lived until 2014, spending over 70 years institutionalized. She died in obscurity. The palace response, when the truth emerged, was tepid at best. Buckingham Palace claimed the Queen Mother had no knowledge of their whereabouts, that it was all a clerical error, that the listing of their deaths was the mistake of a distant cousin and a misunderstanding, not malice. But these weren't distant relatives. They were nieces, first-degree blood relatives. Their father was the Queen Mother's brother. They were in the direct line of succession, albeit distantly. Their existence and their condition was known, which makes the denial all the more chilling. Nerissa and Catherine's story didn't stay unique for long. Further, investigation revealed that 3 more cousins, daughters of Fenella and John Trefusis, Fenella being another Bowes-Lyon relative, were also institutionalized in Earlswood. That's 5 royal cousins, all with cognitive disabilities, all institutionalized and forgotten. Coincidence or cover-up? What's even more disturbing is the context. This happened during the reign of George VI, Elizabeth's husband and the Queen's father. A monarch who struggled with a stammer, a man who knew the agony of public scrutiny. And yet, in the same era that the royal family championed strength through adversity, they quietly buried their weakest members behind locked doors. There's a grim irony in the fact that the royal family, known for their extravagant palaces and sprawling estates, couldn't spare the dignity of acknowledgement for their own flesh and blood. Not a single letter, not a visit, not even a funeral marker. It's easy to paint the monarchy as out of touch. It's harder to face the moments when their distance becomes cruelty. But these were not the only royals to be smeared by shadows they couldn't outrun, because a generation earlier, a different royal, young, handsome, and never crowned, was at the center of a rumor so disturbing it still stirs debates among armchair historians and conspiracy theorists alike. He was charming, he was troubled, and he was in exactly the wrong place at the wrong time. His name was Prince Albert Victor, and some say he was Jack the Ripper. 15. Prince Albert Victor's suspected crimes. In any other royal family, Prince Albert Victor would have been a historical footnote. The sensitive, ill-fated eldest son of Edward VII, born too early to matter, died too young to make a difference. But this is the British royal family, and in this family, no one disappears quietly. Instead, Albert Victor, known to friends and family as Eddie, became the center of one of the most macabre and persistent conspiracy theories of the last 150 years. Namely, that the heir to the throne of England was, in fact, Jack the Ripper. Let's set the scene. London, 1888. The East End was a labyrinth of gaslight and poverty, a slum crowded with the forgotten and the desperate. Then came the murders, brutal, ritualistic, and chilling in their precision. The killer left behind no witnesses, no fingerprints, just terror. The case captured the world's imagination. Hundreds of theories bloomed. Most involved shadowy men, butchers, failed doctors, or psychotics. One, however, rose above the rest, not for its plausibility, but for its audacity, that a member of the royal family had committed the crimes, and that the British establishment had covered it up. And the most frequently named suspect? Prince Albert Victor. The theory goes like this. Albert Victor was mentally unstable, sexually deviant, and possibly suffering from syphilis. He frequented brothels. He had questionable associations. According to this version of events, he either committed the murders in a psychotic break or witnessed them and was implicated by proximity. Either way, the Crown intervened to protect its own, orchestrating a cover-up that has lasted more than a century. Except none of that has ever been proven. Most historians agree that Albert Victor had neither the intellect nor the opportunity to carry out such calculated crimes. His alibis for most of the murder dates are solid. He was travelling. He was at Sandringham. He was, in some cases, hundreds of miles away. The case against him relies on hearsay, forged letters, and the British public's endless appetite for royal scandal. So why has the rumour survived? Because Albert Victor was the perfect vessel. He was already fragile, described as dull-witted and effeminate by his tutors. He struggled academically. He was frequently ill. His very presence in the royal family seemed off. He wasn't quite right for the throne. Even his family knew it. When he died of pneumonia in 1892, the court mourned but also exhaled. His younger brother George would become George V, a more traditional monarch, steadier, more controllable. Albert Victor's death spared the monarchy from a reign that might have been unstable, or far worse. But it didn't spare him from being turned into a myth. The Jack the Ripper theory remains unproven, unsupported, and mostly discredited. But it reveals something deeper about the British monarchy, the way it absorbs and deflects guilt, the way uncomfortable truths are smoothed over until they blur into fiction, and how even the most unfounded rumor, if it fits the right narrative, can outlive the facts. Albert Victor never ruled, but in death he became a cautionary tale of privilege, of paranoia, and of a royal house forever haunted by the possibility that sometimes the monster might come from within the palace. And speaking of palaces hiding sins, let's talk about George I. Because, centuries before all this, a different king locked his own wife away for adultery, or so the story goes. But the real scandal, he might have been a bigamist himself. 16. The Hanoverian bigamy rumour. By the time George I arrived in England in 1714 to claim the British throne, he had already left a lot behind. His native Hanover, a string of enemies, and, most awkwardly, his wife. Not in the figurative sense. He had quite literally left her locked away in a remote German castle, never to be seen in public again. Sophia Dorothea of Chell, the mother of George's children, had once been the Duchess of Hanover and consort-in-waiting, but long before George became King of Great Britain, he had accused her of adultery, imprisoned her in Alden House, and kept her there for over 3 decades. 30 years. No trial, no divorce, no release. She wasn't just exiled, she was erased. This in itself would be more than enough for a dark royal secret, a locked-away wife, a marriage gone radioactive, a queen who never got to be queen. But the deeper scandal lies not in what Sophia Dorothea allegedly did, but what George might have done himself. Because while he publicly condemned his wife for infidelity, there were persistent whispers that George I was guilty of bigamy, that he had entered into a secret, possibly illegal second marriage while still married to Sophia. The woman at the centre of this rumour was Melusine von der Schulenburg, George's longtime mistress, and, depending on which account you believe, possibly his wife in everything but official title. She accompanied him to England and was quickly elevated to Duchess of Kendal, given her own apartments, staff, and a level of court influence that far exceeded that of a mere consort. The British public, already suspicious of their new German king, quickly grew fascinated and appalled by Melusine's power. Satirists referred to her as the Scarecrow for her gaunt appearance, but behind the mockery was genuine unease. Melusine had access, influence, privilege. She signed documents on George's behalf, received bribes for favours, and was said to whisper into the king's ear on matters of policy. And yet, she was never officially acknowledged as queen, because legally, George still had a wife, one he had imprisoned without ever granting a divorce. So what was Melusine? Some believed she was secretly his second wife, married in a private ceremony either in Hanover or England, under cover of night and silence. Others claimed she had performed a kind of morganatic marriage, a union allowed in some German principalities between royals and non-royals, in which the spouse does not receive the rank or titles of her husband. A sort of royal loophole for convenience and optics. Of course, if George had married Melusine while Sophia Dorothea was still alive, it would have been a crime, not just under church law, but under the laws of succession. Bigamy for a monarch wasn't just scandalous, it was a constitutional mess. It could throw the legitimacy of heirs, treaties, and even George's claim to the throne into question, which is likely why, if the marriage did happen, it was never acknowledged. Better to let history assume she was just a mistress with perks than admit the king had broken one of the very laws he was crowned to uphold. But even if George didn't formally marry Melusine, their relationship exposed the uncomfortable flexibility of royal morality. He could imprison his wife for an alleged affair, refuse her release for decades, and simultaneously parade his mistress across court with impunity. Because the crown, like the law, was what the monarch said it was, especially in the early 18th century. Sophia Dorothea died in 1726, still imprisoned. She never saw England, never saw her children again, never defended herself. Upon hearing of her death, George reportedly shrugged, no public mourning, no acknowledgement, and when George himself died a year later, collapsing in his coach on the road back to Hanover, he too left a legacy not of greatness but of silence, a monarch who ruled not with grand ambition but with quiet cruelties. But the hereditary line he left behind would produce something far more damaging than locked-away wives or secret ceremonies. It would produce a queen whose blood would spread through Europe like a slow curse, passed from generation to generation, thinning royal lines, destroying dynasties, and changing the very fabric of European monarchy. Her name was Victoria. Her legacy was hemophilia. 17. Queen Victoria's hemophilia legacy. Queen Victoria is often remembered as the matriarch of modern monarchy, the grandmother of Europe, the woman who presided over an empire so vast it became common to say the sun never set on it. But behind the black mourning dresses, the endless portraits, and the image of stoic propriety, Victoria carried a genetic time bomb, one that would quietly unravel her legacy across multiple continents, one that no coronation, treaty, or naval fleet could protect against. Hemophilia. A rare and dangerous blood disorder, hemophilia prevents the blood from clotting properly. The most minor injury, a bruise, a small cut, even a bump, can lead to internal bleeding, severe pain, and in some cases death. In the 19th century, it was often fatal. There was no treatment, no cure, just silence, pain, and early graves. Victoria was a carrier of the hemophilia gene, a fact that seems medically unfair considering how much of her reign was about control. Yet this one thing, hidden in her DNA, slipped through every palace wall, blood test, and engagement announcement. She had 9 children, and at least 2 daughters inherited her carrier status, unknowingly spreading the disease through Europe's royal houses. Her son Leopold, Duke of Albany, was the first obvious casualty. He suffered from hemophilia his entire life and died at the age of 30 after slipping on a staircase and suffering a brain hemorrhage. But the damage didn't stop there. Her daughters married into foreign royal families, as expected. Princess Alice married Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse. Their son, Friedrich, known as Fritti, inherited the disease and died at age 2 after falling from a window, bleeding internally for hours. Alice died young, consumed by grief and illness, leaving behind a lineage forever marked by fragility. But the most famous and geopolitically catastrophic case of Victoria's genetic legacy would be through Princess Alix of Hesse, Alice's daughter, and Victoria's granddaughter. Alix married Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, becoming Empress Alexandra. Their son, Alexei, was born with hemophilia. In an empire already teetering from unrest and revolution, the heir's fragile health became a state secret. Alexandra, desperate to protect her son, turned to mystics and holy men for healing, including Grigory Rasputin, the so-called Mad Monk, whose influence over the Romanov court became a national scandal. Rasputin's presence, invited through the desperation born of hemophilia, helped discredit the monarchy, fuel conspiracy theories, and hasten the Russian Revolution. And so, a gene passed from one queen in England helped doom the last Tsar of Russia. Victoria's descendants ruled Germany, Spain, Greece, Romania, and beyond. Many of these royal houses were soon plagued by mysterious illnesses, weak heirs, or sudden deaths. Some of it was bad luck, but some of it was hemophilia, hidden until it struck, impossible to plan for, impossible to explain, in a world that still saw royal blood as sacred and divine. This was the quiet terror of Victoria's legacy, that her influence was felt not through war or conquest, but through chromosomes, Her very body undermined the monarchies she helped build. Her descendants didn't just inherit her titles, they inherited her mutation. And as monarchies began to fall across Europe from revolutions, assassinations, and wars, a strange and bitter footnote remained that one woman's DNA may have helped turn the 20th century. Because when your blood can't clot, history does. But even among royals who suffered from illness, weakness, and private despair, few were publicly humiliated like Queen Caroline, wife of George IV, a woman whose private life became a public theatre and whose so-called sins were paraded through courtrooms and cartoons for all of London to judge. 18. Queen Caroline's affairs. She was crowned queen without her husband, booed by courtiers, loved by commoners, and followed everywhere she went by an army of cartoonists and spies. Queen Caroline of Brunswick, wife of George IV, may be one of the most humiliated women in the history of the British monarchy. But what turned her from consort to cautionary tale wasn't merely a failed marriage. It was the trial, the rumours, and the very public, very deliberate dismantling of her reputation. Caroline arrived in England in 1795 to marry George, then Prince of Wales, in what can only be described as a diplomatic hostage exchange. George didn't want to marry her, and he made that painfully clear from the moment she stepped off the boat. According to his own words, he was drunk at the wedding. He found her repulsive. She found him revolting. After consummating the marriage exactly once, just long enough to produce their daughter, Princess Charlotte, the pair separated permanently. From there, Caroline embarked on a life that was half exile, half soap opera. She was essentially banished from court, given a residence and stipend, but denied access to the royal stage. George continued his affairs, most notably with Maria Fitzherbert, whom he had illegally married years earlier. But while George's mistresses were tolerated, even accepted, Caroline's behaviour, whether real or imagined, was weaponized against her. Whispers began to circulate that Caroline was entertaining male visitors, travelling with suspicious companions, and living a life unbecoming of a future queen. Most famously, during her extended stay in Italy, she took up with an Italian servant named Bartolomeo Pergami. Whether he was her lover, bodyguard, or something in between remains unclear, but their closeness became the obsession of the English press and of George. By 1820, when George ascended the throne as George IV, he made it clear he wanted Caroline nowhere near the coronation. His solution: put her on trial, publicly, before Parliament. The goal: to strip her of her title and prevent her from ever becoming queen. The Pains and Penalties Bill was an extraordinary moment in British legal and royal history. It accused Caroline of adultery and inappropriate conduct and sought to dissolve her marriage on the grounds of immorality. What followed was a spectacle. Witnesses were summoned from across Europe. Former servants gave statements about Caroline's supposed affairs, her alleged immodesty, and her unconventional behaviour. The details ranged from the plausible to the absurd. Sightings of her in compromising positions, claims of intimate relationships with staff, rumours of wild parties, and scandalous letters. But here's the thing. The more the trial unfolded, the more the public began to sympathise with Caroline. She was painted as a foreign woman cast aside by a corrupt king, punished for refusing to be silent. George IV, meanwhile, was deeply unpopular. The people saw his lavish lifestyle, his cruelty, his public mistresses, and compared it to Caroline's exile, her loneliness, her refusal to vanish. She became a folk hero. Crowds cheered her name. Pamphlets were printed in her honour. Public sentiment turned against the monarchy. The government, fearing riots and unrest, eventually dropped the bill. Caroline remained queen in name, but was still barred from the coronation. On the day of the ceremony, she attempted to enter Westminster Abbey and was turned away at the door, in full view of the public. It was the final humiliation. She died just a few weeks later, in August 1821, at age 53. Her funeral cortege once again became a battleground. Protesters clashed with guards, windows were smashed, barricades were erected to stop her coffin from passing peacefully. It was a fittingly chaotic end for a woman who had spent her life being both elevated and erased by royal politics. What makes Caroline's story so striking isn't whether or not the rumors were true, it's how quickly royal morality collapses under contradiction. George IV was permitted his vices. Caroline was punished for hers, real or invented. She became the scapegoat for a monarchy anxious to protect its image by destroying its inconvenient women. And while her story may feel uniquely cruel, it's far from isolated. Because long before Caroline was scandalized for her supposed lovers, one English king lived his entire life without producing a single legitimate heir, and historians have never stopped asking why. Was it political, personal, or something else entirely? The man in question? Richard the Lionheart. 19. Richard the Lionheart's heirless marriage. He was the crusading king, the warrior prince, the embodiment of chivalric myth, Richard I of England, better known as Richard the Lionheart. Songs were written about his bravery, legends exalted his battlefield cunning, statues still cast his silhouette in bronze outside Parliament, and yet, for all his glory, Richard died with no legitimate heirs, no children, no sons, no daughters, nothing. In the world of medieval monarchy, that wasn't just a personal failure, it was a dynastic crisis. So naturally, the absence of offspring raised questions, and those questions over time grew into rumours. Born in 1157 to King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, Richard was a middle child in a famously dysfunctional royal family. His brothers included the treacherous John, later King John of Magna Carta fame, and the equally ambitious Geoffrey. Richard was his mother's favourite, and eventually he became king after leading a rebellion against his own father. So far, very royal. But when it came to family life, Richard's record was suspiciously quiet. He married Berengaria of Navarre in 1191, during the Third Crusade. The wedding was politically motivated, arranged to secure an alliance with the Kingdom of Navarre. Berengaria travelled to meet Richard in Cyprus, where the marriage was performed with due ceremony. But after the vows were exchanged, the Queen faded almost entirely from historical record. Berengaria never set foot in England, she never had children, and she spent much of her marriage living apart from her husband. This would be strange enough for any royal couple, but Richard's status as a conquering, crusading king only magnified the peculiarity. Why didn't the great hero of Christendom produce an heir? Theories abound. One of the most persistent rumours is that Richard may have been celibate, at least functionally so. Some historians have suggested that his commitment to the Crusades, his piety, and his political entanglements left little room for romance. Others point out his close relationships with male courtiers, particularly with King Philip II of France, with whom Richard shared a bed during negotiations. In medieval times, this wasn't necessarily scandalous. Shared sleeping quarters were common, but the intimacy described in some sources has sparked speculation. Was Richard gay? Was he simply disinterested in marriage? Was he sterile? The truth is lost, but the speculation persists. In 1195, under pressure from the Church, Richard publicly confessed to sins of the flesh and received absolution. Some interpret this as evidence of homosexual behavior, others as the standard religious theater of a guilty crusader. What's clear is that his personal life remained private, painfully so, and that his marriage never fulfilled its dynastic purpose. Richard died in 1199 from an infected wound sustained during a siege in France. His younger brother John became king, a development that most chroniclers viewed with dread. Had Richard produced a legitimate heir, English history might have followed a very different path. Instead, his reign remains a study in contradiction. He spent less than 6 months of his 10-year rule in England. He spoke French better than English. He was crowned with thunderous cheers, and yet he ruled like a phantom, appearing more in myth than in person. A king with a sword but no shadow, a monarch without a dynasty, and in that absence lies the mystery. Richard's body was buried, his sword was passed down, his titles were inherited, but his bloodline, it ended with a whisper, which leaves us with one final irony, that the man most revered as the pinnacle of English kingship may have been the one least interested in continuing it. And as it turns out, suspicion over royal reproduction wouldn't stop with Richard, because centuries later, another queen would also face public whispers, not for lack of heirs, but for too many funerals. Her name was Anne of Denmark, and her crown came with witches. 20. Anne of Denmark's witchcraft panic. Anne of Denmark's journey into the English royal family began with storms and ended in whispers. Married to James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, Anne was no stranger to the grand performances of royalty. She was raised in the court of Denmark, fluent in etiquette, charm, and ceremonial subtlety. But when she boarded her ship to sail to Scotland in 1589 to join her new husband, a storm struck the fleet, violent, unrelenting, and deadly. That storm, an otherwise unlucky maritime event, triggered one of the most infamous waves of witch trials in European history, and Anne, whether she knew it or not, would forever be tied to a quiet but deeply unsettling fear that some force, supernatural or otherwise, didn't want her on the throne. The shipwreck was blamed not on weather patterns, but on witchcraft, specifically Danish witches who, it was claimed, had conspired to kill the future queen. Several women were arrested in Denmark and tortured until they confessed to raising storms through magic. The Danish court, no stranger to religious panic, executed them, but the storm and the paranoia it seeded followed Anne to Scotland. James, shaken and ever susceptible to conspiracy, became obsessed with the idea that dark forces had targeted his marriage. In 1590, he launched the North Berwick witch trials, accusing dozens of people of plotting against him and Anne through black magic. These trials were vicious, confessions were extracted under torture, and many were executed. The entire event was driven by a king's fragile certainty that the storm which nearly killed his bride was a spiritual attack. Anne, for her part, kept quiet. Publicly, she was a supportive consort. She gave birth to several children, though many died in infancy, which only furthered the whispers. Behind closed doors, her influence on James was more complex. Some historians suggest she was the more rational of the two. Others think she quietly encouraged James's interest in the occult, attending masques and sponsoring art that danced on the edge of religious and mystical imagery. But the death toll mounted. Anne gave birth to 7 or more children. Only 3 survived infancy. Prince Henry, her first son and James's heir, died at age 18 of typhoid. Elizabeth survived, married into the Palatinate, and became a matriarch of European Protestantism. And Charles, fragile, lisping, shy, would become Charles I, the king who lost his head in the English Civil War. For Anne, motherhood was not a role filled with celebration. It was punctuated by funerals, miscarriages, stillbirths, public mourning and private dread. In a court already haunted by superstitions, every loss became an opportunity for whispers. Did Anne bring a curse from Denmark? Was her bloodline poisoned? Was God punishing the Stuarts? The irony is stark. While witches were being burned for conjuring storms and causing stillbirths, the royal family itself suffered from the same tragedies. And yet, instead of being accused, Anne was shielded by her rank, and the chaos she brought was filtered through the language of martyrdom and divine testing. As she aged, Anne withdrew more and more from court life. Her relationship with James cooled. Some accounts suggest she lived separately from him in her later years, devoting herself to art, architecture, and her own household. She died in 1619, Aged just 44, from what was recorded as dropsy, edema, her health deteriorated by years of stress, pregnancy, and grief. Her legacy was complex. She helped introduce a continental, theatrical flair to English court culture. She sponsored masks, performances, and artworks that elevated the monarchy's image. But she also became, however unwillingly, a vessel for fear. Her presence at the start of James's reign in England carried with it the echoes of North Berwick, the scent of suspicion, and the quiet suggestion that something followed her from Denmark. Something intangible and unwelcome. And while the witchcraft trials faded, the obsession with royal children did not, because just a few decades later, another rumor would emerge, one with no torture chambers or confessions, just a missing boy, a shattered monarchy, and a mystery that crossed borders and centuries. A French royal child presumed dead, a British crown quietly watching, and a connection few dare to make outright. 21. The Lost Dauphin Connection. In 1795, a 10-year-old boy reportedly died in the Temple prison in Paris. He was pale, neglected, sickly. His body was riddled with scars and sores. He had been separated from his family, denied contact, beaten into silence. He was buried quickly, with no ceremony. The official record claims that this was Louis Charles, the Louis XVII of France, the son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, heir to the French throne and the last hope of the Bourbon dynasty. But not everyone believes he died there. The story of the lost Dauphin has persisted for over 2 centuries, haunting the fringes of royal history like a half-remembered dream. The claim is simple and stunning, that the boy who died in the Temple was not Louis Charles at all, but an impostor. That the real Dauphin was smuggled out, replaced and hidden, and more disturbingly, that he may have found shelter in Britain, perhaps even with the help, or at least the knowledge, of the British royal family. The logic is tempting. Britain had everything to gain from keeping the French monarchy alive in exile. A restored Bourbon throne would be a counterbalance to revolutionary France. A living Dauphin would be a powerful symbol, one the British could use quietly to undermine the new republic. If such a child had escaped, there were few safer places for him than within the orbit of England's sprawling royal network. Throughout the 19th century, multiple men came forward claiming to be Louis XVII. The most famous was Karl Wilhelm Naundorf, a German clockmaker whose story was so compelling that several members of the French royal family accepted him as genuine. He claimed to have been rescued, smuggled out of the Temple, and placed under British protection. His descendants still insist he was the true Dauphin. The British royal family never publicly commented. DNA testing in the 1990s, conducted on heart tissue believed to be from the boy who died in the Temple, suggests the body was, in fact, Louis Charles. The DNA matched with living descendants of Marie Antoinette. Case closed? Not quite. Skeptics point out the murky chain of custody surrounding the preserved heart. It had passed through many hands over 2 centuries. Doubts linger about whether it was ever truly retrieved from the Temple or whether the switch happened before burial. And the fact that the British Royal Archives remained silent, never confirming nor denying any involvement, has kept the speculation alive. After all, silence is its own kind of confirmation. In Britain, the idea of harbouring the lost French prince would have been politically delicate. On one hand, it offered an opportunity to support monarchical legitimacy abroad. On the other, it could trigger scandal at home. Monarchs sheltering deposed child kings tend to invite civil unrest. The safest move? Hide him in plain sight, erase his name, give him a quiet country life, far from palace intrigue. Let history forget whether the lost Dauphin ever crossed the Channel may never be proven, but the British royal family's proximity to the story, and their stubborn silence about it, leaves room for unease. Because if Louis XVII did survive, and if Britain did protect him, that would make the House of Windsor complicit in rewriting European history. and more importantly, it would make them custodians of a bloodline that wasn't theirs to keep. But the Tudors, too, have their share of mistaken identities. Because just as France speculated about a dead prince who might have lived, England whispered about a living queen who might have died and been replaced. It's a story so bizarre it reads like a folk tale. But the rumours persist. They call it the Bisley Boy. 22. The Bisley Boy legend. It sounds like a village folk tale, the sort of story told in whispers around old pubs with crooked beams and fading tapestries. And yet, this tale, strange, persistent and unsettling, sits right in the centre of the English royal mythos. It challenges not just the identity of a queen, but the foundation of a dynasty. The legend of the Bisley Boy suggests that Elizabeth I, England's most iconic monarch, was not the woman history remembers, but a man in disguise. According to the tale, sometime in 1543 or 1544, young Princess Elizabeth, then just 10 or 11 years old, was sent away from London to the village of Bisley in Gloucestershire to escape an outbreak of plague. A precautionary move, routine for the time, but something allegedly went terribly wrong. The story goes that Elizabeth died while in the care of her household. Some say she succumbed to a fever, others claim it was an accident. Either way, the caretakers were paralysed with fear. How could they report the death of the king's daughter, his only legitimate child by Anne Boleyn, without facing royal wrath? And so they found a replacement. According to the legend, a local boy who resembled Elizabeth, possibly a distant relative or a servant's child, was dressed in the princess's clothes and presented as her. The deception, it said, was so convincing that no one noticed, or rather, no one dared to notice. By the time Henry VIII came to visit, the switch had already been made, and whether out of denial, calculation, or genuine belief, the king accepted what he saw. The boy, now groomed in every sense, continued to live as Elizabeth, and when the time came, she became queen. The idea is absurd on the surface, and yet it has survived for centuries. Why? Because the contradictions in Elizabeth's life, when viewed through this lens, begin to align in deeply eerie ways. First, her lifelong refusal to marry. Despite countless suitors, despite pressure from Parliament, Elizabeth remained single. Her famous declaration, "I am married to England," was framed as patriotic, symbolic. But what if it was, in fact, the most elegant evasion in royal history? Second, the strict control of her image. Elizabeth wore layers of elaborate clothing. Her portraits were highly stylized, more icon than woman. Her court was fiercely protective. Foreign dignitaries rarely saw her in private, and rumours of her physical appearance were tightly managed. She was almost always surrounded by female attendants who slept near her chambers and guarded her routine. Third, her autopsy was never recorded. When Elizabeth died in 1603, her body was shrouded and buried without the kind of detailed royal post-mortem that had become typical for monarchs. Was this because of respect or secrecy? Proponents of the Bisley Boy theory argue that the ruse, once begun, could never be undone. The stakes were too high. Elizabeth was the last Tudor. England's future depended on her legitimacy. To reveal the truth would have thrown the nation into chaos, and perhaps worse, handed the crown to Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic heir with French ties. Still, most historians dismiss the legend as baseless. There is no hard evidence. The tale originated centuries after Elizabeth's death and was popularized by Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, in a speculative essay. Critics argue that the logistics alone make the story impossible. How could a boy have been trained, educated, and maintained the deception for decades? And yet, it lingers, because monarchy is built not on truth, but on belief. And when belief fractures, even just a little, everything begins to wobble. Was Elizabeth truly who she claimed to be? Or was she the most successful impostor in English history? Either way, the mystery refuses to die, and that perhaps is the most Tudor trait of all, the ability to live on in the gaps between myth and history. But even before Elizabeth wore the crown, her family had its share of physical secrets, hidden conditions, quiet shame, and skeletons that wouldn't stay buried. None more famous or more divisive than the one found beneath a parking lot in Leicester. A man long vilified as a deformed tyrant. But what did his bones actually reveal? 23. Richard III's deformities. For over 500 years, Richard III has existed as a contradiction, both a king and a villain, both a historical figure and a theatrical monster. Immortalized by Shakespeare as a hunchbacked tyrant who murdered his nephews for the throne, Richard became one of the most hated characters in English history, almost too evil to be real. But what if some of it was real? In 2012, an archaeological team in Leicester uncovered a skeleton buried beneath what used to be a monastic church and later became a car park. The bones, twisted and worn, showed clear signs of scoliosis, a severe curvature of the spine. DNA testing confirmed it. These were the remains of Richard III, lost for centuries and now quite literally unearthed. It was a macabre resurrection, and it reignited one of history's oldest debates. Was Richard's physical condition exaggerated to match his supposed crimes, or did his deformity shape the narrative around him? Shakespeare, writing under the Tudor regime, had every reason to demonize Richard. After all, it was the Tudors, specifically Henry VII, who defeated Richard at the Battle of Bosworth and founded the new royal dynasty. Casting the previous king as deformed, child-murdering, and unhinged wasn't just convenient, it was politically necessary. According to Tudor chroniclers, Richard had a withered arm, a crooked back, and a malevolent stare. He was painted as a man both physically and morally malformed, but most of these accounts were written after his death. None were eyewitnesses, and some were suspiciously aligned with Tudor propaganda. The discovery of Richard's skeleton brought nuance back to the conversation. Yes, he had scoliosis, but not a hunchback. His spine was curved, not grotesquely misshapen. His arms were symmetrical. There was no evidence of a limp or a clubbed foot. In fact, by the standards of the 15th century warfare, he was remarkably intact. Until, of course, the fatal battle wounds that killed him. So where did the image of the monster come from? Partly from history, partly from fiction, but partly, too, from fear of physical imperfection. In medieval and early modern England, bodily deformity was often seen as a sign of divine judgment or inner corruption. A misshapen body was proof of a misshapen soul. Richard's real medical condition, scoliosis, likely developed during adolescence. It would have been painful, possibly limiting, but not disqualifying. He fought in battles, wielded weapons, led armies. He wasn't crippled, but he was different. And that difference became a canvas for myth-making. The great irony is that Richard, unlike many monarchs, was a capable administrator. He implemented reforms, protected the rights of ordinary people, even instituted protections for those accused of crimes, a concept that would later influence English law. But none of that fit the narrative of the crookback villain. Instead, he became the embodiment of royal degeneration, his body used as a metaphor for tyranny. The real tragedy: Richard may not have killed his nephews. The princes in the Tower vanished under suspicious circumstances, yes, but there was no trial, no confession, no body, just assumption. Richard had motive, but so did others. Henry VII, the Duke of Buckingham. And yet it was Richard who wore the guilt. Because of his back, because of his legend, because sometimes history prefers a clear villain to a murky maybe. His bones now rest in Leicester Cathedral under a simple black slab. Nearby is a statue, stoic, not monstrous, and his reburial was attended by thousands, many of whom came not to mourn a king, but to acknowledge a man miscast by history. But Richard's story isn't just about a distorted spine. It's about how the monarchy uses deformity, rumour and silence to shape its image. And no king understood the power of appearances better than his descendant, George IV. A man so desperate to reshape his image, he hid the one woman who knew the truth, his real wife. 24. George IV's secret marriage. George IV was never what you'd call restrained. He spent like an emperor, dressed like a peacock, and ate as if food might go out of fashion. But for all his extravagance, nothing about George's reign rattled the royal foundations quite like the secret he tried desperately to erase. His illegal, possibly binding marriage to a Catholic widow named Maria Fitzherbert. This wasn't just a royal fling, it wasn't a passing scandal. This was a full-fledged, behind-closed-doors marriage ceremony that broke both the law of the land and the unwritten rules of monarchy. To understand the weight of this secret, you need to understand who George was before the crown. As Prince of Wales, he was entitled, indulged, and frequently in debt. He was also subject to one brutal rule. He could not marry a Catholic, nor could he marry without the king's consent, thanks to the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, a piece of legislation designed to stop exactly this kind of chaos. And yet, in 1785, at the age of 23, George fell obsessively in love with Maria Fitzherbert. She was everything a prince was not supposed to want: a Roman Catholic, a twice-widowed commoner, and crucially, a woman entirely uninterested in becoming a royal mistress. Maria refused him repeatedly until he threatened suicide. Whether out of affection or exhaustion, she relented. On December the 15th, 1785, in a secret ceremony conducted by a clergyman, George and Maria were married, and from that moment on, everything changed. Legally, the marriage was invalid. It broke the law. It was treasonous. But emotionally, politically, and morally, it bound them together. George considered Maria his true wife. He referred to her as such in private, kept portraits of her, and once even wore a miniature of her eye set into a ring, one of the more Victorian forms of creepy romance. But publicly, silence. The Crown, the government, and even Maria herself agreed to keep it quiet. The stakes were astronomical. Had the union been acknowledged, George would have forfeited his place in the line of succession. His father, George III, would have been furious. Parliament would have been humiliated. And worse, Maria would have become a Catholic royal consort, something the Protestant establishment would never tolerate. So George did what royals do best when backed into a corner. He lied. He denied the marriage in public. Later, when he needed money desperately, he agreed to an arranged marriage to Princess Caroline of Brunswick in exchange for Parliament clearing his debts. He called it a political necessity. Maria called it a betrayal. And yet, the bond between them didn't entirely break. Even after George married Caroline, a disaster in itself, he continued to correspond with Maria. He oscillated between adoration and abandonment, frequently trying to rekindle their relationship while keeping her far enough away to avoid further scandal. When his father died and George finally became king in 1820, Maria hoped for public recognition. Instead, she was granted silence and a small pension. But the documents told a different story. After George's death in 1830, a sealed packet labelled private papers was discovered in his personal effects. Inside were letters, declarations, and evidence of the secret marriage. Maria, in one of her last acts before her death in 1837, destroyed them on the condition that the Crown acknowledge the truth quietly and protect her name from further attack. To this day, the British royal family has never formally acknowledged the marriage. The Church of England has never commented. The history books, meanwhile, continue to ask an uncomfortable question. If George IV's real wife was a Catholic widow he married in secret, and his public wife was a woman he loathed and separated from, then who exactly was the Queen, and which marriage mattered more? The real scandal isn't that George married Maria Fitzherbert, it's that he spent the rest of his life pretending he hadn't. But he wasn't the only monarch with strange tastes in companionship, because George's own mother-in-law, Queen Victoria, would later form a relationship that rattled the palace just as deeply and possibly produced a secret line of descendants far removed from the red carpets and balcony waves. His name was John Brown, and Victoria's obsession with him blurred every royal boundary. 25. Victoria's obsession with John Brown. By the time Queen Victoria met John Brown, she had already buried a husband, a father to 9 children, and the last person she ever claimed to truly love. Prince Albert's death in 1861 sent her into a mourning so severe that it became public policy. The Queen wore black for the next 40 years. Court life dimmed, public appearances ceased. Even her servants were required to wear mourning dress. Into this cavern of grief stepped John Brown, a Scottish servant from Balmoral, sturdy, blunt Protestant, and seemingly unimpressed by rank. He was originally employed as one of Albert's outdoor servants, tending to the Queen's horses and assisting on hunts. After Albert's death, he remained in her service, and slowly over the years he became her closest companion. That word, companion, does a lot of work here. Brown was more than a servant. He called Victoria woman to her face. He drank, he swore, he carried a pistol under his coat. He escorted her on walks, stood watch at her door, and served as a kind of one-man security detail. He was given privileges no other servant could dream of, his own room near hers, authority over household staff, and access to the Queen that many of her ministers envied. Soon, rumours began to swirl, whispers of a romantic relationship, hints of physical closeness. Servants overheard their conversations. A bishop once walked into a room to find them alone and visibly startled. Satirical cartoons began appearing in the press, dubbing her Mrs. Brown. One even depicted the Queen heavily pregnant. Was it love? Was it codependency? Was it emotional compensation for a woman who had never truly recovered from Albert's death? We'll likely never know. Victoria never admitted to anything improper, but she did write about Brown extensively in her private journals, dozens of entries filled with fondness, affection, and a degree of emotional transparency missing from her public persona. After Brown's death in 1883, Victoria went into a second mourning. She commissioned a life-size statue of him, placed a lock of his hair in a locket beside Albert's, and continued referring to him as her best friend. Upon her death in 1901, among the personal items placed in her coffin was John Brown's photograph, hidden in her hand. Even that detail caused an uproar. Her family, especially her son Edward VII, loathed Brown and tried to erase his presence from the official record. Letters were destroyed, memorials were moved, but the rumours refused to die. Some historians, even today, wonder, did Victoria and Brown marry in secret? Was there an unrecorded union, a second Fitzherbert moment, or was it something more modern, an emotional partnership that didn't fit the labels of its time? Others take the speculation further. Were there children? While no credible evidence has ever surfaced to prove this, fringe genealogies have traced potential descendants, families in the Scottish Highlands who, according to oral tradition, bear the Queen's blood. The idea is tantalizing but unverified, and perhaps that's what makes it so enduring. Because Brown, unlike Albert, was never meant to be remembered. He wasn't a prince or a political figure. He was a servant, low-born, uneducated, and uncontrollable. And yet he carved out a place not just beside the Queen, but inside her most guarded space, her grief. And that intimacy, more than anything, terrified the institution. What if love, not rank, granted someone access to the Queen? What if the monarchy could be touched, not just bowed to? Victoria's reign may have reshaped the modern image of royalty, but her relationship with John Brown remains its greatest contradiction. A queen defined by duty, who may have found salvation in the arms of someone utterly beyond it. And speaking of brothers and shadows, George VI wasn't the only Windsor with secrets, because his brother George, glamorous, charming, and rebellious, left behind a legacy of affairs, addictions, and sudden death that still makes Buckingham Palace uneasy. 26. George VI's brother's affairs. George VI, the reluctant king, the wartime symbol, the man who overcame a stammer to speak for a nation, was the kind of monarch history loves to romanticize. Steady, dutiful, quietly heroic. But his family, not quite so restrained. His older brother, Edward VIII, made headlines for abdicating the throne to marry a divorcee and went off to flirt with fascism. But it was Prince George, Duke of Kent, the fourth son of George V and Queen Mary, who may have been the most controversial Windsor of all, precisely because his scandals were so carefully erased. To the public, Prince George was dashing, aristocratic, and fashionable, a naval officer turned civil servant, with an air of effortless sophistication. He was the first royal to work in a government department, the Admiralty, and was praised for modernizing the image of the monarchy. But behind the polished facade, George's personal life was a symphony of contradictions, rumors, and quietly buried disasters. Whispers about Prince George's affairs began early, and they didn't stop. He was linked romantically to a long list of glamorous women, from socialites to actresses. His most public affair was with the singer and actress Florence Mills, and his name was also linked to the composer Noel Coward, among others. He was rumoured to have had affairs with both men and women, an open secret within elite London circles. But in the 1930s and 1940s, that wasn't just scandalous, it was dangerous. There were also persistent rumours of substance abuse. Biographers and historians have noted Prince George's alleged use of morphine and cocaine, even suggesting he had been treated for addiction at discreet clinics, though no official record confirms this. The press, bound by deference and self-censorship, never printed it. But within the palace, George's behaviour was reportedly seen as erratic, unpredictable, and deeply worrying. Still, the royal family kept him in the fold. He was married in 1934 to Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, a match that, on paper, was perfect. She was royal, beautiful, and suitably distant from domestic scandal. They had 3 children, including Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, who remains a working royal today. Yet even in marriage, Prince George was restless. His affairs allegedly continued, so did the whispers, but none of it ever reached the level of public disgrace, because it was quietly managed, hidden behind royal curtains, disguised with titles and tours. Then, in 1942, Prince George died suddenly in a military air crash in Scotland. He was serving in the Royal Air Force and was on board a short Sunderland flying boat when it went down under still mysterious circumstances. He was the first royal to die on active military service in over 500 years. The official story was that it was a tragic accident, but immediately conspiracy theories bloomed. Why was a senior royal on a military flight with no clear destination? Why were so many details of the crash classified? Was he flying the plane himself? Was there an unregistered passenger on board? And why, for decades, did the palace remain so tight-lipped about the incident? Some suggest George had been involved in secret diplomatic missions. Others think he was being quietly exiled, kept away from scandal. Still others believe he may have been trying to flee, though from what, no one can say. His death was public, but his life remains strangely redacted. He was a prince with modern instincts, but a medieval burden, the pressure to hide everything real behind a polished portrait. And when the frame cracked, the palace simply hung a curtain in front of it. And yet, Prince George wasn't the only Windsor tied to inconvenient family roots, because his brother-in-law, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, carried shadows of his own. Shadows that reached all the way to Nazi Germany. 27. Prince Philip's Nazi relatives. When Prince Philip married Princess Elizabeth in 1947, he brought with him little more than a borrowed uniform, a noble title stripped of power, and a surname so politically charged it had to be replaced. What he also brought, whether intentionally or not, was a collection of family ties the House of Windsor would spend years trying to reframe. Because the future Duke of Edinburgh, long hailed for his blunt charm and naval service, was closely related to multiple members of the Nazi regime. Born in 1921 on the kitchen floor of a Greek villa, Philip of Greece and Denmark was exiled from his homeland as a baby and raised across Europe, often separated from his parents. His mother, Princess Alice of Battenberg, was a deeply religious, deaf, and psychologically complex woman. His father, Prince Andrew of Greece, was a military commander who spent most of Philip's childhood absent or in exile. But it was through his 4 sisters, all of whom married into German nobility, that the Nazi connections took root. Each of Philip's sisters married high-ranking German aristocrats, men with titles, estates, and, in several cases, direct affiliations with Adolf Hitler's regime. Most notably, Princess Sophie, the eldest, married Prince Christoph of Hesse, a member of the SS and a personal favorite of Heinrich Himmler. Christoph worked directly under Himmler's jurisdiction in Nazi intelligence and was also a Luftwaffe officer. Princess Margarita and Princess Theodora both married German princes with strong nationalist ties, and several of their relatives were part of pro-Nazi groups. During the 1930s and early 1940s, the Battenberg, now Mountbatten line of the family, was split between those in Britain and those embedded in continental German politics. While Philip was training in the British Royal Navy and fighting in World War II, his own brothers-in-law were fighting on the other side. This wasn't just awkward, it was potentially scandalous. At the time of his engagement to Elizabeth, the royal family made a deliberate effort to cleanse Philip's image. His surname was anglicised from Battenberg to Mountbatten. His sisters were not invited to the wedding. His German ancestry was downplayed, and the press, ever loyal, didn't ask too many questions. But the facts remained. Philip's closest relatives had been part of the Third Reich's social and political elite. Some even attended Nazi rallies. Photographs exist, grainy, uncomfortable, of Philip at family gatherings in the 1930s, surrounded by swastika armbands and Heil Hitler salutes. Whether he shared their views at the time is unclear. He was young, detached from his family, and seemingly uninterested in ideology. Philip himself later described his relatives as Germanophile and admitted that the associations were deeply embarrassing. His service in the Royal Navy during the war, fighting against Germany, seemed to redeem him in the eyes of the establishment. But for decades, the topic remained off limits. Only in recent years, with the release of letters and biographies, has the full picture emerged. Prince Philip was not a Nazi, but he was intimately connected to people who were. This is the paradox of monarchy. Bloodlines don't choose sides, they just continue. And if royal blood can flow from Buckingham to Berlin without pause, it begs the question, how many other secrets are buried in these families that span borders, religions, and ideologies? Because Nazi affiliations aren't the only thing lurking in the shared veins of European royalty. There's another, older danger, not political, not ideological, biological, a pattern that repeated itself so many times across so many generations it couldn't be ignored, a royal tradition that masqueraded as purity but left behind a legacy of weakness and death. It's called cousin marriage, and it nearly collapsed entire dynasties. 28. The cousin marriage problem. If you trace enough royal family trees, you'll notice something odd. They don't branch, they loop. Royal blood from the Middle Ages through the 19th century was guarded like a sacred relic. Marrying outside of aristocratic or royal circles was unthinkable. Unions were diplomatic strategies designed to seal alliances, not diversify genetics. and that meant cousins, sometimes first cousins, sometimes closer, were the preferred partners. The result? A centuries-long biological echo chamber. In the British royal family, this became especially problematic during the reigns of the Hanoverians, the Victorians, and into the early 20th century. Marriages were arranged not for love or even compatibility, but for titles and blood, and while this kept dynastic claims pure, it introduced another factor: genetic bottlenecking. The classic example? Queen Victoria herself. As mentioned earlier, she was a carrier of hemophilia, a deadly blood disorder that spread like wildfire through her descendants into the royal families of Spain, Russia, and Prussia. That mutation was the genetic cost of her tightly controlled lineage. But the problem extended far beyond a single gene. Royal offspring began to show higher incidences of mental illness, infertility, and congenital disorders. Some were hidden. Others became the stuff of international embarrassment. Take the Habsburgs, close cousins of the British royals. The infamous Habsburg jaw wasn't just a caricature. It was the visible marker of over 16 generations of cousin marriages. By the time Charles II of Spain came to power in the late 1600s, his genetic profile was so compromised that he was sterile, partially paralyzed, and reportedly couldn't chew solid food. The British family, while spared some of the more extreme deformities, wasn't immune. George III's mental decline may have had hereditary roots. Queen Victoria's many children carried unexplained ailments, and several lesser-known royals, kept conveniently out of the spotlight, were quietly institutionalized, hidden away, or simply omitted from official records. The insistence on cousin marriage wasn't just a medical oversight, it was a social strategy gone wrong. Monarchy depended on the illusion of divinely ordained superiority. To marry a commoner, or even a noble too far removed from the main European bloodlines, was seen as a dilution. Ironically, it was the refusal to dilute that led to the decay. By the early 20th century, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Scientists, politicians, and even royals began to rethink the practice. Laws were introduced, marriages diversified, but by then, the damage had already been done. And perhaps the most surreal legacy of this practice, the notion that some of Europe's most powerful rulers were physically unfit to rule, not because of war or scandal, but because their own blood turned against them. But even as cousin marriage was falling out of favor, older habits proved hard to break, especially when the stakes were high. Like, say, when a Catholic king suddenly produced an heir no one had ever seen before, and the rumors began that the baby didn't belong to the royal couple at all. In fact, it may not have belonged to anyone in the palace. They called it the warming pan baby. 29. James II's warming pan baby. The year was 1688, and England was on the brink, religiously divided, politically unstable, and growing increasingly wary of a king whose every move seemed to point toward an unwanted return to Catholic rule. James II, the last Catholic monarch of England, had already made himself deeply unpopular with Parliament and the Protestant majority. But then came the final spark, the event that many claimed wasn't just controversial, but an outright hoax. On June the 10th, 1688, Queen Mary of Modena, James's second wife, gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward Stuart, a Catholic male heir, and that, as they say, was a problem, because this baby changed everything. Until that point, James II's daughters, Mary and Anne, were his Protestant heirs, and much of Protestant England was nervously tolerating their Catholic father under the assumption that this was all temporary. Once James died, the throne would pass to one of his daughters and Protestantism would remain safe. But the birth of a Catholic male heir threatened to establish a new Catholic dynasty. It wasn't just succession, it was potential revolution. So within hours, a rumor began to spread. The baby wasn't real. Or rather, it wasn't theirs. The theory was that Queen Mary had not given birth at all, but that a stillborn or non-existent child had been replaced, or a healthy baby had been smuggled into her bed in a warming pan, a metal container traditionally used to heat beds in the 17th century. According to this tale, the Queen had either miscarried or faked the entire pregnancy, and Jesuit conspirators had arranged for a peasant baby to be brought in under cover of night. The story, though wildly implausible, spread like wildfire. After all, it confirmed everything many already feared, that the Catholic king was manipulating the line of succession and staging a religious coup from the royal bedchamber. What made the conspiracy so durable was its sheer believability to the suspicious. There had been no witnesses in the bedchamber who weren't Catholic. Many Protestant courtiers had been excluded from the birth. The Queen's pregnancies had previously been plagued by miscarriages and stillbirths, and crucially, the newborn was quickly whisked away after birth, further fueling theories of deception. In response, James ordered an official inquiry to prove the legitimacy of the child. Over 40 witnesses, midwives, physicians, nobles, testified that the birth was genuine, but it was too late. Public opinion had already crystallized. The myth of the warming pan baby was too perfect, too politically convenient to let go. Later that same year, James II was overthrown in the Glorious Revolution, replaced by his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange. James and his wife fled to France with the baby prince in tow, but the story of the fake heir followed them. James Francis Edward Stuart, as an adult, would be known as the Old Pretender, and his claim to the throne would always be shadowed by the question, was he ever really James's son? Whether or not anyone truly believed the warming pan tale is beside the point. What mattered is that people wanted to believe it. It gave them moral clarity. It allowed Parliament to justify removing a king without admitting rebellion. It made a political revolution feel like an act of justice. And in royal history, perception is everything. But the suspicion didn't stop with birth, because sometimes it's not what's added to the royal record that reveals the truth, but what's deliberately removed, like diaries, letters, pages torn from history by someone with the power to edit a queen's memory. 30. The missing royal diaries. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, she left behind not just a sprawling empire, but a voluminous mountain of personal writings, journals, letters, and reflections stretching across more than 60 years of rule. An estimated 141 volumes, meticulously maintained, offering a daily glimpse into the mind of a queen who ruled longer than anyone before her, and yet most of them are gone. Not missing in the sense of misplaced, but deliberately, surgically removed, rewritten, redacted. The culprit, Victoria's youngest daughter, Princess Beatrice. Beatrice was the Queen's constant companion in her later years, a devoted caregiver and confidant. She also became, after Victoria's death, the self-appointed editor and censor of her mother's private legacy. Tasked with preparing the Queen's journals for publication and historical preservation, Beatrice made a decision that would permanently reshape royal history. She transcribed the entries by hand, editing as she went, and destroyed the originals. What did she remove? We'll never know for sure, but the missing material, based on historical references and inconsistencies in the remaining texts, likely included political frustrations, personal grief, frank opinions about family members, and, perhaps most intriguingly, her deeper emotional entanglements, especially with John Brown and later Abdul Karim, the Indian servant who became Victoria's unexpected companion in her final decades. The surviving diaries offer a sanitized, ceremonial Victoria, devout, reserved, politically neutral. But historians suspect that the real Victoria was far more complex, emotionally volatile, deeply political, and unafraid to express favoritism, resentment, or grief in unfiltered terms. Beatrice, in her attempt to preserve the monarchy's image, flattened the Queen into a symbol, and while her efforts may have been loyal, they also constituted a profound historical theft. There's something chilling in the idea of a daughter rewriting her mother's inner world, of entire years erased, emotions softened, scandals redacted. The version of Victoria we now know, imperial icon, widow in black, Empress of India, is partly fiction, not by invention, but by omission. In recent decades, scholars have tried to piece together the missing elements. Surviving letters from other family members, marginalia from foreign observers, and fragments from earlier drafts suggest a monarch far more opinionated and emotionally raw than her public image allowed. Victoria may have mourned Albert, yes, but she also craved intimacy, sought companionship, and expressed powerful attachments that made her court uncomfortable. The question is not just what Victoria wrote, but why someone needed to hide it. Was it to protect her image, or to protect the family from truths they didn't want to face? Perhaps both. Either way, the erased diaries leave a vacuum in the historical record. And in that vacuum, myths grow, speculations thrive, just like the warming pan baby, or the Bisley Boy, or the missing princes in the tower. When a royal truth is hidden, it doesn't vanish, it multiplies. But sometimes the secrets aren't found in the Queen's hand. Sometimes they're in the quiet room at the end of the hall, the one with the locked door, the one the public wasn't meant to see, the one where a boy lived and died almost entirely in secret. 31st, Prince John's hidden life. He was born into royalty, but you've likely never heard of him. Prince John, the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary, came into the world in 1905. At first, he was treated like any other royal child, doted upon, photographed, dressed in miniature versions of naval uniforms and sailor suits. He was the sixth child of the future king and queen, and though not in direct line for the throne, his birth was celebrated. But as he grew, something changed. By the age of 4 or 5, John began showing signs of developmental delay. He was prone to outbursts, struggled with language, and eventually began suffering from epileptic seizures. In the early 20th century, the British royal family, like much of society, viewed neurological and developmental disorders not with compassion but with shame, and so John was slowly removed from view. He stopped appearing at public events, his name vanished from royal press releases, photographs ceased. While his siblings received titles, roles and military training, John was relocated to a private estate, Wood Farm, on the Sandringham grounds, where he lived under the care of a governess and a small medical staff. His condition worsened. He was likely on the autism spectrum, though that term didn't exist at the time. Combined with his epilepsy, his behavior was deemed unmanageable for palace life. By the time the First World War broke out, John was essentially erased from royal memory. He died in 1919, at the age of just 13, after a severe seizure. The official announcement was brief. Few photos remain. For decades, the family made little to no mention of him. Why? Because John didn't fit the image. The royal family, especially in the early 20th century, was obsessed with projecting stability, strength, and perfection. A disabled child, no matter how beloved, challenged that image. And rather than confront that, they chose silence. But there's evidence John was deeply loved. His nurse, Charlotte Bill, known as Lala, was fiercely protective of him. His mother, Queen Mary, visited regularly. His siblings wrote fondly of him in private letters. He wasn't unloved, just invisible. In recent years, efforts have been made to restore John's place in royal history. Biographies, documentaries, and even dramatizations have explored his life with sensitivity. But the fact remains, for much of the 20th century, John was treated not as a prince, but as a problem. His story is a reminder that even within the most privileged of families, the margins still exist. And sometimes, royalty isn't about power. It's about how power defines who gets remembered and who gets hidden. But John's legacy, however faint, casts a long shadow. because he wasn't the only royal child to suffer under the weight of expectation and the myth of divine inheritance. Long before him, another king's mind fractured under the pressure. A king so passive, he once lost his throne. By doing absolutely nothing, they called him Henry VI. 32 Henry VI's catatonia. Imagine a king who forgets he's king. A ruler so lost in thought, or perhaps lost altogether, that he does not react to the birth of his own son. Does not speak, does not move, does not respond. Not to questions, not to prayers, not even to pain. This was Henry VI, a monarch whose reign was punctuated not by tyranny, but by something far more unsettling: absence. Born in 1421 to Henry V, the war hero King of Agincourt, and Catherine of Valois, Henry VI inherited the crown as a baby, just 9 months old. England rejoiced at the continuation of the royal line, but fate had other plans. From the beginning, young Henry was delicate, quiet, pious, unnaturally withdrawn for a child raised to command. As he matured, his behavior grew stranger. He disliked violence and abhorred confrontation. He preferred prayer to politics, contemplation to command. But it wasn't just temperament. In 1453, at the age of 31, Henry experienced a complete mental collapse. He fell into what chroniclers at the time called a madness. Today, we might call it catatonia. For more than a year, Henry did not speak. He did not acknowledge those around him. He showed no reaction when his son, Edward of Westminster, was born, a moment that should have secured the Lancastrian line. The court panicked. Was the king possessed, cursed, or simply broken? Into the vacuum stepped Richard, Duke of York, who was made protector of the realm during Henry's stupor. This shift in power planted the seeds for the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York. Henry eventually recovered, partially, but the damage was done. His authority had evaporated. Parliament doubted his stability. Nobles picked sides. Queen Margaret of Anjou, fiercely protective of her son's claim, became the real power behind the throne. And Henry? He remained a ghost of a king, drifting in and out of lucidity. Historians have long debated what afflicted him. The leading theories range from schizophrenia to bipolar disorder to hereditary mental illness. It's worth noting that his maternal grandfather, Charles VI of France, had suffered similar breakdowns, believing he was made of glass and could shatter. Madness, it seems, was genetically baked into the Valois bloodline. What made Henry's condition so dangerous wasn't the illness itself, it was how monarchy refused to accommodate it. A king was not allowed to be unwell. Royal authority, divine and absolute, could not afford fragility. So when Henry failed to perform the role, when he could not speak, rule, or even stand, England crumbled around him. Eventually, the Yorkists triumphed. Henry was deposed by Edward IV, imprisoned, and briefly restored before being overthrown again. In 1471, shortly after the death of his only son, Henry VI died in the Tower of London. The official line was melancholy. Unofficially, likely murdered, but even in death, Henry remained a symbol not of tyranny, but of what happens when the system has no space for human failure. His tragedy wasn't that he was evil or incompetent, but that he was fragile in a job that required infallibility. And the most haunting part, his bloodline continues. Because a generation later, another monarch would rule in defiance of the very religion that once accused his ancestors of madness. His name was Charles I, and his secret leaned not into silence, but into heresy. 33. Charles I's secret Catholic sympathies. To the world, Charles I was a Protestant king. He ruled a Protestant country. He married a Catholic French princess, yes, but that was diplomacy, not doctrine. Officially, the Church of England was supreme, and Charles was its earthly head. Unofficially, the lines blurred. Charles was no Henry VIII. He wasn't loud about his faith. He didn't pick fights with the Pope, but he did something arguably more dangerous. He sympathized. Whispers about Charles's true religious leanings began early in his reign. He married Henrietta Maria of France, a devout Catholic who refused to be crowned by an Anglican bishop. She brought Catholic priests into the royal court, held private masses, and raised their children in an environment steeped in ritual and incense. Charles didn't just tolerate this, he defended it. Worse, he championed religious policies that looked to his subjects suspiciously Catholic. He supported Arminianism, a theological movement that emphasized free will and rituals, alarmingly close to Catholic doctrine. He promoted William Laud to Archbishop of Canterbury, a man obsessed with ceremonial splendor and restoring traditional church decorum. To the average English Protestant, especially the rising class of Puritans, this wasn't just suspect, it was treasonous. Add to that Charles's belief in the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs answer only to God, not Parliament, and you had a recipe for rebellion. He refused to compromise. He dissolved Parliament multiple times. He levied taxes without consent. And all the while, his enemies whispered, "He's not one of us. He's a Catholic in disguise." The tipping point came in 1641, when rebellion broke out in Ireland and English Protestants were massacred by Catholic forces. Parliament, fearing that Charles might use Irish troops to enforce his rule at home, began arming itself. In response, Charles tried to arrest 5 members of Parliament in person. It failed, and civil war erupted. Throughout the conflict, Catholic support for Charles became more visible. Irish soldiers fought for the Royalists. Henrietta Maria sought help from Catholic France, and when Charles was finally captured and brought to trial, his Catholic sympathies were listed among his unforgivable sins. In 1649, Charles was executed, publicly beheaded in front of a crowd. He met his end not just as a failed monarch, but as a man many believed had betrayed England's soul. Of course, Charles never converted. No document proves he took the sacraments, but his softness toward Catholicism, his love for ceremony, and his refusal to bend made his loyalty forever suspect. After his death, England became a republic under Oliver Cromwell, and Catholicism was pushed even further to the margins. But when the monarchy was restored under Charles II, the religious dance resumed, subtle, cautious, and always just one rumor away from chaos. Charles I's downfall wasn't just political, it was theological. He blurred the line between crown and cross, and in doing so, he reminded the world that royal power doesn't rest on laws, it rests on faith, which makes you wonder, in a system where monarchs are chosen by God, what happens when they choose God back, but in the wrong form? Maybe that's the darkest secret of all. Not that royals commit sins, but that sometimes they're punished for trying to be devout.